This video culminates the entire first season of exclusive Amiga games, covering 100 of these. If you've seen the episodes separately, there's not much new for you here, but if you haven't, it's gonna be a fun one. It's difficult to imagine that Agony came out in 1992, especially if you get to experience it today on a high-resolution flat screen. It's pure beauty, it's art. A literal agony of colors that looks beyond fantastic. It's a masterpiece, and an excellent title to start this video with. But Psygnosis did have a flair for extraordinary, and it clearly shows in this game too. What Agony also is a horizontally scrolling shoot 'em up. You play as Magician's Apprentice, yes, not wizards, not warlocks or sorcerers, but magicians, and yeah, there is a difference between them. A Magician's Apprentice is that lady that Dave in Blaine cuts in half, or Copperfield really. Blaine did other stuff. So yeah, you're said apprentice and you're turned into an owl to destroy the dark creatures invading the beautiful land, and eventually learn of the so-called cosmic strength. Questionable logic of picking all rather than the human form as the deadlier one aside, Agony is great. It features 6 pretty long levels with beautifully animated and parallax scrolling backgrounds, dozens of different enemies, consisting mainly of various deadly insects and animals, and weapon upgrades, if you could call them that, as you're not really shooting a weapon but magical projectiles. Agony's presentation, as you can see, is phenomenal. It's on another level and something that could hardly be replicated on any other system in 1992, at least not running on a 7 MHz CPU. The sprites are huge and nicely animated, there's a lot of them on the screen at once, and the backgrounds are as good, if not better. Sounds and music are also spot on and round up this gaming package nicely. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Agony is beautiful, but is it fun? After all, it's not the graphics but the gameplay that makes or breaks the title. And I'm happy to say that yes it is. It's definitely not the best shoot 'em up on the Amiga, but it's a really good one, and easily one of the better looking. Especially if you keep in mind that it runs on all, even most basic Amigas, provided they have at least 1 MB of RAM. It's a classic. After Doom landed on PC, Amiga users contracted a probably much more severe case of the Doom fever than PC gamers ever had, because Doom on PC required a beefy hardware and nothing else. On Amiga, given its architecture, we were told that it was impossible to pull off. Naturally, a statement like that invites a challenge, and many devs strived to prove that it actually was doable. And while technically speaking it ended up being quote-unquote possible, the architecture really did not support the efforts, and the games were usually running slow and had considerable hardware requirements, often outside of monetary capabilities of a regular Amiga gamer. Alien Breed 3D2, The Killing Grounds, is the last Team 17's game on the Amiga, and it kinda shows as it feels a bit rushed and unoptimized. But other than that, extremely polished and competent effort. At the time of its release, it was easily in the top 3 Doom clones on the Ami. It starts directly after the first game ended and drops you right into fast and frantic action, which is built out of 16 levels that, while linear, are all quite fun and real interestingly designed, keeping you on the edge of your seat all throughout. There's obviously obligatory keycards that you need to find to progress, so while simple at its design, the environmental puzzling is present and as good as in the game Alien Breed 3.2 was based on. There's also 10 different weapons available, so you'll hardly ever get bored. Enemies seem to possess some kind of very basic AI, adjusting their approach and attacks depending on the weapon that you're wielding, so they won't run straight at you if you're carrying something that would mow them down in a second. Which may not seem like a lot, but it's a nice touch nonetheless. Sadly, there's no music during gameplay, but the ambient sounds more than make up for it, creating a silent, menacing atmosphere that is both exciting and terrifying. Alien Breed 3D2 has a rather hefty hardware requirements, and while it could theoretically be run on any AGA system with at least 2 MB of RAM, it's a nightmare to play in this configuration, as it will sport huge pixels and a stump-sized gameplay screen. To put things into perspective, a user going by the name of Karpov wrote on Lemon Amiga's website in the comments section for this game just a few days ago that he runs the game now on 68060 CPU overclocked to 100 MHz. So something that was rather improbable in 1996 when the game released, and that it can still run sluggish. I'm gonna be a bit controversial here, though it is my honest opinion. Alien Breed 3D2 should be played on the best Amiga out there, so a PC through emulation. Go ahead, destroy me in the comments below if you like it. But you know that for this game at least, I'm right. On April 30th, 2022, one Sideshow Bob, whose name I've no doubt butchered here beyond recognition, wrote this on Lemon Amiga's game page about Arabian Knights. If there ever was a game that needed a graphic overhaul and rebalancing, this is it. It sits on the edge of greatness, but doesn't quite make it. I couldn't have put it better myself. These 2 sentences summarize the game perfectly. It's a title that does everything well. Graphics, sound, level design and gameplay, everything. But nothing exceptional. And while it's definitely one of the most unique and memorable platformers on the Amiga, it's short of these few last coats of polish, paint, or whatever you wanna call it, for ascension to something bigger, better, and more unforgettable. Made by the team that brought us Soccer Kid, Arabian Knights is unusually for the 90s themed platformer with heavy Middle Eastern culture influences present all throughout. And that's something that wasn't common back in the day. Come to think of it, I don't think it's much different now. Anyway, the game's built out of few differently stylized worlds split into smaller levels with occasional flying carpet shooter-like areas in between. It's quite varied and doesn't get stale all throughout its short, more or less an hour-long playthrough time. I remember playing Arabian Knights to death as a kid with a friend living 2 floors up in the same apartment building. It may have been one of the many games we've played together, but somehow it is the one that I ended up remembering fondly. Countless hours swapping joystick between us, playing a stage or life per person, never managing to complete it though. Fun. Also testament to how great of a gamer I was and am to this day. But all sentimental stuff and quote-unquote memories of better days aside, if that's even possible, other than the occasional honestly funny moments, Arabian Knights is just a typical platformer that does everything well. There's nothing it's much better at than others, but there is also nothing that it's particularly worse at either. It's a decent all-rounder and an excellent example of Amiga exclusive that could have gained much wider popularity if it ever released on other systems. Amber Moon is second after Amber Star in Talien's never-finished fantasy trilogy of excellent role-playing games. It begins over 50 years after the first game, with the world of Lyramion just starting to recover after the events of the previous title. You play as a grandchild of the protagonist of Amber Star, who is now an elderly man and summons you to tell you of the vision that he had, and it's really a grim one. So, he sends you on a quest to figure out what's behind its meaning. While you start alone, over the course of the game you'll be able to recruit more characters for a total of 6, so it's best to build your party so that they all would complement each other. All their physical attributes can be trained, however, by finding an appropriate NPC teacher. So even if they're not perfect from the get-go, with a bit of care, they can become so eventually. Overworld traversal and most interiors are in top-down 2D view, while dungeons and the rest of the game is played in 3D first-person perspective. But unlike other role-playing games utilizing this viewpoint, the movement is not in step-by-step format, but entirely fluid and real-time. Combat is initiated when you meet the enemies and is also played in first-person perspective, but with use of tactical board and in my beloved turn-based mode. In Amber Moon, party formation is so important that having a properly placed characters may be a deciding factor in your wins and losses. So if you keep losing, experiment the hell out of it. Other than the overarching main quest, there's quite a few of side tasks, and many of them will require some simple puzzle solving. They are not mandatory, but are fun and will help you raise your party's experience to be ready for the more challenging main quest. Amber Moon features a full day and night cycle that obviously influences what NPCs are available and where they are, as all of them have their own schedules, which may not be anything new in the genre, but is always a welcome addition. Characters have to eat and rest periodically to recover, and items get worn out and broken, and will require appropriate craftsmen to repair them. In dark areas and during nights, torches and lanterns are obviously a must and will illuminate the surroundings. The towns are large, more detailed than previously, and diverse. And in general, Amber Moon's world seems to be coherently put together to form a believable land with its history, lore, and races. Amber Moon is a challenging title, and each and every battle won feels like a well-earned achievement, and you will quickly no doubt form bonds with your teammates caring for their survival and not only for your mission. While perhaps not a very well-known game, Amber Moon was easily one of the best RPGs on the system, and it is well worth visiting even today, decades after its original release. Despite its very appealing and state-of-the-art graphics, at least for the platform it released on, Apocalypse is really just a glorified Choplifter clone. But oh my days, how amazing of a clone it is. Even if ungodly difficult and plagued by countless cheap deaths. In theory, Apocalypse is your Airwolf type of a game, so you have a generic evil rebel forces taking over a small island in the remote part of the ocean, and they imprisoned many of your allies that's stationed in the 5 of island's bases. Your task is as simple as they come. To destroy all of the bases, enemy units, be it mobile or ground, and the battleship docked somewhere on the island. Most of all, however, to save as many POWs as you can. And that's as much as it's easy about Apocalypse, as it feels like a game that would feel most comfortable on the cabinet in the arcades, happily munching on countless supply of coins from frustrated players' pockets. It's that tough. The overwhelming enemy forces, anti-aircraft rockets coming from off-screen all the time, and a rather large helicopter sprite as compared to the whole gameplay area are the main reasons for Apocalypse's challenge. So unless you're a god-level patient and can muster enough strength to approach it very cautiously and methodically, you're either gonna die a lot or get frustrated with it and rage quit. Sounds are exceptional and feature many supposedly small and unnecessary details, but as you play, in the heat of the action, even if they're separately undistinguishable from one another, all form a realistically unbelievably sounding jungle. And with painstakingly detailed backgrounds and sprites that all scream "Apocalypse now" from the screen, it makes you feel like you're actually in the movie, and that your in-game life is actually in danger at all times. Apocalypse is not for everyone, but if you like Souls-likes and side-view action games, it's a great mix, one of the best on the Amiga. Raven Software's Black Crypt is a culmination, a masterful achievement in step-by-step, first-person, party-based role-playing games genre on the Amiga. But what about Eye of the Beholder? Dungeon Master? Have you forgot about Dungeon Master? Hello? Ishtar Trilogy, perhaps? And yes, you're right, they're all important, amazing and incredible games in their own rights. But Black Crypt is an exclusive, and the other landed on everything they could run on. There is even an unofficial Eye of the Beholder port on C64 now, which on a side note is something that I will have to take a closer look at in one of the future videos, cause that's a game that had no reason to run on a small 8-bit system, and yet it does. Anyway, coming back to Black Crypt. After being banished from the land of Astera, a powerful evil cleric, a store of Paingiver, a beautiful surname I must add, returns with a huge army of the undead and demons, and once again good prevails and the cleric is sealed away magically in the titular Black Crypt. 20-something years later, when the game takes place, he's attempting to break free from his magical shackles to get revenge on those who wronged him. You take control of 4 heroes, beacons of strength and good, and they must enter 28 levels deep dungeon to find 4 artifacts, powerful weapons that will be required to defeat the evil. I'm Batman! Bruce is saying that he's a beacon too, but judging by how he let himself go sitting on my couch eating snacks and doing pretty much nothing else, I'd say that he's closer to bacon than beacon. Whatever. You start the game by creating your party of 4, and they are a fighter, cleric, magic user and druid. Personally, if it was up to me and possible within the game, cause it's not, I would drop the druid for another heavy melee damage dealer. But it is what it is. All of them have some very basic equipment and food, as they have to eat and drink to survive. You know, like in real life. So you gotta collect all the food you find and make sure to refill your flask at all wells you come across. All the characters other than the fighter can cast different spells. The most important of them all, a wizard side spell, is basically an automap which will be more than useful all throughout your adventure. Other than the main quest, there's quite a few side ones, big and small, and they add a lot to the depth of gameplay and world building. Black Crypt's presentation is stellar. Sounds and music are of the highest quality and graphics are way above what even Eye of the Beholder or Ishtar games could offer, using Amiga's rarely utilized EHB mode, which allows for 32 unique colors to be used along with another 32, but at half brightness, for an overall palette of 64. I don't have to tell you that the environments look lush and detailed, even if they're basically just underground dungeons. But as you go deeper and deeper, the design changes, never letting you get bored with it. So unlike Dungeon Master, for instance, you never feel like you're looking at the same wall all the time. Black Crypt is an excellent title that all fans of classic RPGs should experience. Period. Breathless's story is so incredibly bad that I will summarize it with a couple of sentences only, as it's not worth time it will take me to do so in detail. Yours or mine. Human race has been enslaved, and while some still fight against the alien invaders, for the most part they're unsuccessful. And when these rebels are caught, they are remade into cyborgs and put into arenas to fight for their life, and potentially freedom. I don't know how stupid you'd have to be to believe that alien overlords would free you after first transforming you into a killing machine and then having you compete against others, just to prove that you're the best of the best out of them all. But whatever, it is what it is. Breathless is an AGA-exclusive first-person shooter where you have to go through 20 increasingly more demanding stages, literally killing everything that pops up on the screen. An old rule, if it moves shoot it, applies here perfectly, cause if it moves, it wants you dead. As you dispose of countless enemies, you collect credits, which then later on can be used at computer terminals to purchase new or upgrade your current weapons. Naturally, as in most shooters, there's doors that impede your progress, and you either have to find keycards to open them or appropriate switches. While there's few weapons to choose from, they're not visible on the screen at all, and all you get is a crosshair, which makes the game feel a bit weird and getting a newer, better weapon less impactful. But that, to be honest, is a reoccurring theme in most Amiga Doom clones. Fortunately, the gameplay itself is quite fun, even if it gets out repetitive fast because of all the walls and all the enemies looking samey, all grey and bland. But, and that's a pretty huge but for a rather quality-limited Amiga FPS scene, Breathless runs incredibly well on a basic A1200. Not great, mind you, but much better than it has any right to. and better than most of its competition. It obviously benefits from more powerful systems, turbo cards and extra RAM, all the shebang, but it's not unplayable on weaker configurations. All of Breathless's technical prowess and optimization, while undoubtedly impressive, cannot sadly change the fact that at the very best, because of it being so dull, it's only ever good fun for short gaming sessions. When Brian the Lion first came out in 1994, I had a lot of other platformers on my Amiga, so while I did get it as well, notably by rather unethical means, I did not find it any more interesting or better playing than these that I enjoyed already, so I disregarded it quickly and never gave it any real attention. Which, I can tell you now, was a mistake, as it's not only fun but also a pretty good game too, provided you get used to the controls, which sadly still feel a bit clunky and not as precise as in other games in the genre. You play as Brian the Lion, and you must rescue your friend Chris the Crystal from the evil Giza the Dragon who kidnapped him. But before you'll be able to do so, you'll have to plow through around 40 platforming stages and defeat Dragon's henchmen along the way, bury the bear and Graham the Gorilla. To complete the level you have to avoid or defeat all the enemies along your way to the exit by either hitting them with your claw or jumping on their heads, Mario style. All the while collecting as many crystals as you can so that you could use those then later at the shops buying extra lives, credits, bigger jumps, speedups and other upgrades. Interestingly enough, there's quite a few secret areas to find and get to, and bonus stages too. It prolongs the stay of the title considerably, especially that most platformers tend to be extremely linear and repeatable, so games that take that extra step to add hidden sections are always something that I appreciate. Brian the Lion's presentation is really good, and no wonder, as it was developed by Reflections, the very same that made all the Shadow of the Beast games, that were well known as the graphical benchmarks for what the Amiga was capable of in the right hands. So sprites are large, nicely animated, and same can be said about backgrounds. They're rich, feature many objects that either animate or react to your character touching or walking over them, and numerous levels of parallax. It's great. Sounds and music are also appropriate to the type of the game that it is, but nothing above the Amiga average. Overall, Brian the Lion is a good game, but not a great one, and will never ever be one, simply because it fails on two major fronts when it comes to platforming design. It features regenerating enemies and, worst of all, many leap of faith jumps, where you have to trust your gut and hope for the best. It usually works out for the better, but not always. So yeah, it's a decent game that could be much better. Cedric and the Lost Sceptre is a side-view fantasy action platformer, and most importantly, a proof that the game with visuals close to those of Shadow of the Beast could also play great. Story-wise, you're Cedric, sadly a young nobody, but you're also madly in love with the princess. Since you're virtually unknown, however, the king sends you on a quest to prove your worth, so that you'd be good enough to earn her hand, you must find and retrieve King's Lost Sceptre. For the most part, Cedric is an action platformer in which you leap over obstacles, climb countless ladders, slide down the ledges, collect coins and even beat up various baddies and monsters, usually punching them into a pulp. But it's also a full-fledged adventure with all that it entails, so you'll meet various characters and speak with them too, learning of what to do next and where, and we'll even do some basic environmental puzzling. There is quite a few situations where it's necessary actually, and they're usually clearly indicated above our hero's head. There's 11 levels that you have to go through, and each of them is differently stylized and unique, and they all look rather pleasant. They often also pose different challenges, both puzzling and platforming wise, so you'll hardly ever get bored playing. All that said, Cedric is a difficult game to find its player, because while it's genuinely novel and entertaining, it's neither a perfect choice for a fan of platformers nor for an adventure lover. It sits somewhere in between in an odd place, where its mixture of genres only ever appeals to a small subset of all gamers, which is also why it's perhaps as little known game as it is today, and why I should really have used it in my obscure Amiga games series. But if you're a person who doesn't fear new and change, it's definitely an experience to be had, and a game to steal a few good hours from you before you complete it. Team 17's Assassin Special Edition is what Amiga's ports of Strider should have been, but fell a bit short, and an upgraded and fixed version of the original Assassin that released 2 years prior. Everything that didn't work as intended, was broken, annoying or unfair in the first game, was ironed out, removed or polished, and we've ended up with a gem that's not in the rough anymore. Assassin Special Edition is a side-scrolling action platformer. Both games share identical story of having to go through few large stages with a goal of destroying of so-called Midan, a crazy evil villain bent on causing havoc and gaining power over the world that's basically within his grasp. It's worth mentioning that the original had an extra stage before the one the second game starts with, but it was cut, and for the life of me I can't tell you why. Perhaps because it featured dogs that you could kill. We'll never know. More importantly, in the first Assassin you started with a boomerang, which, if you think about it, given the sheer scope of enemy forces you have to face, is not a weapon that guarantees any degree of success, and a rather shitty choice for an assassin that made the game borderline unplayable. This time, you begin with a laser. Now, laser gun is a seriously deadly apparatus of destruction, and can definitely make a serious dent in enemy lines way before you even change it for something bigger and better. And you will, cause there's a lot of weapons to find and use this time. The enemies are quite varied too, and it's a pleasure to best them all, feeling like a James Bond, John Rambo or any other generic 80s movie superhero doing so. While you go about it, you also get to collect gold stars, and getting 50 can activate a mega weapon, which is more powerful than anything else, and 99 rewards an extra life. Mega weapon, that sounds epic. Mega weapon. Yeah. Anyway, each level ends with a large boss, so it's best to save those super special mega weapons that I keep talking about for that occasion in particular. It's just a hint and not a rule, so do whatever your assassin's ass pleases to. Graphics and sounds are all Team 17 quality, meaning they're great but not the best, and while they could be improved at, no doubt about that, they're nothing to ever complain about. Overall, Assassin Special Edition is a more complete, even if shorter and easier package than original was, but also way more polished and rounded up experience that's now a fun rather than frustrating game it was before. Even if a bit on a tough side, at least to me, ATR All-Terrain Racing is one of the best overhead racers on the Amiga. That difficulty though is not unfair, let me make that clear. It's not cheap and it's not there to discourage you from playing. On the contrary, it's there to have you learn how each of the vehicles work, how tracks and their surfaces respond to your chosen car, and so that you could memorize all of them. All the turns and obstacles, everything. It's a racer that rewards perseverance, and doing all that will take a lot of time, and I mean it, a lot. But it will be time well spent having fun, and especially that the ATR can be experienced by up to 6 players on a single Amiga. Sure, so many may require a hardware add-on, but the more the merrier, and it's one of those games that may actually justify purchasing one. There's 42 different tracks in the game divided into 6 unique terrain categories, with 3 of them available from the start: Sports, Forest and Canyon, and the Space, Moon and Alien unlocked by completing all the tracks in the former 3. ATR gives you a choice of 3 vehicles, of 4x4 Jeep, which is used here more as a description of the car rather than the brand, Buggy, which kinda explains itself, and Formula. And yeah, it too is self-explanatory. All of them can be upgraded in between the races with better engine, tires and so on. And it's not optional, I must add, as your opponents, even CPU controlled, will be definitely doing it too. While single-player arcade mode is all about racing and getting better at controlling cars and learning the circuits, the multiplayer mode is an all-out crazy mayhem. Why? Because you get weapons, and trust me, playing fair will not get you far in this one. Graphics and sounds, as you can see, are perfect. They may not be genre-defining or even the best on the Amiga, but they're definitely out there at the very top, hanging with the most stylistically polished games. So the presentation definitely runs up the game as a complete package. ATR, however, came out in an odd time. 1995 was a year when Commodore's been already long bankrupt, Amiga moved between many different owners like some kind of a radioactive hot potato, and the developers couldn't really expect the platform to last much longer, so less and less care was given to games released on the system. ATR is an exception. It's extremely polished and playable. It also received a port to the infamous CD32, which frankly speaking was a joke, as it added nothing. It was virtually the same disc version of the game, but on a CD. All that aside though, if you like top-down racers, there's hardly any better. Same as ATR, Behind the Iron Gate came out in 1995, an odd year for the Amigas as we've already established, but even more so as it was one of the very first serious attempts at Doom-like games on the system, and it spawned in the time when we knew that Doom was impossible on the Ami because of how its graphical chips operated, and a bit before we realized that some people could make impossible possible. So being one of the first few, Behind the Iron Gate was rather rough in its presentation. It had no textured objects, no walls, ceilings or floors had them, and neither did the enemies. Everything was devoid of detail and color, as the game seemed to pick one color per stage and then render everything in its shade, which not only looked weird but also not very eye-pleasing. I'm Batman! I see. Yep. Okay. So, Bruce is asking me to tell you that he too made everything in one color, funeral black, and that it worked. So it's not the idea, but the choice of colors that was the issue in his eyes. It's unimportant. All he ever was good at was catching criminals and eating puddings. He doesn't know about video games. So, coming back to Behind the Iron Gate, it's obviously a first-person shooter. It takes place in a futuristic prison. Your aim, as the title suggests, is to open the gates, carry on through the game to eventually get to the place where you'll be able to initiate a self-destruct sequence. From then onward, you have to escape before the whole complex explodes. Interestingly enough, while the game doesn't feature a visible weapon on the screen and just a crosshair, it does have a mouse-controlled hovering hand that's used for small bits of adventuring, like opening doors or picking up objects. Which, and I have no proof of that whatsoever, leads me to believe that perhaps at some early stages of development it was supposed to be a dungeon-crawling RPG and not an FPS. But whatever, it is what it is. It's worth noting that the game ran on all Amigas with 1 MB of RAM, so at least its requirements were not unreasonable. While the music that accompanies the gameplay is exceptional compared to the rest of the presentation, it's hardly enough to save this, brace yourselves, disappointingly boring and unexceptional title. It looks bland, plays below par, switching weapons is a chore I never really got entirely hang of, and the movement is not perfect either. It's a first attempt, and as that, it's interesting. But it's not a good game. Also, I fulfilled the promise from the first episode in the series. Not all games will be good, but all will be interesting. If you're a long-time viewer of this channel, then you've no doubt heard of Benefactor already. It's a game I seem to be mentioning whenever there's even an imaginary reason for it, just to slide it into the conversation. That's how good it is. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Benefactor is a very unique puzzle platformer. It's a cross between Lemmings, Sleepwalker and a generic platformer of yore, with all the tropes that this entail. So platforms, ladders, risky jumps, enemies, obstacles and hazards, you get the gist. And while it may sound like an odd, even questionable mixture, it's so well designed, programmed and put together that you will not bother yourself with pondering about its origins and will just keep playing. Until you give up, that is. Because as much fun as it is, it's equally as punishing. It's a tough one, and the difficulty curve is rather challenging. To me at the very least. And Benefactor really demands your full attention, nimble fingers and keen mind. While I can pretty much always give you the 2 out of the 3 all at once is not something that happens to me often. Anyway, you control a small, just a few pixels in size character, named with the wordplay on the title, Ben-E-Factor, and his task in each and every level is to save the tiny red creatures, that more often than not are locked away somewhere. Just like in Lemmings, it's all about getting them to safety. Each level is a different logic and platforming puzzle, and each will put your skills to the test. When you unlock the cell the little red dudes are locked in, they proceed to direct themselves straight towards the exit, taking the shortest possible route. Not necessarily the safest, and this is where you come in. Cause same as in the aforementioned Sleepwalker, you'll have to make sure that they'll leave the stage unscathed. To do so, you can pick them up, carry them and throw them. And you will have to, as the path to safety is often a dangerous or locked off one. So you will need to toss them left and right like a ragdoll towards smaller openings that they can pass through, switches that they can toggle, and around the dangers, animated or otherwise, that they would no doubt just walked into. Benefactor is a game that's best understood when played and not watched or talked about. As what may seem at first glance as unimpressive, sometimes is so incredibly rewarding you wouldn't believe. Especially when you figure out the solution to a particularly difficult problem. So, if you ever get a chance, definitely try Benefactor out. Oh, and the presentation is stellar too, in all departments, be it sounds and music or tiny cutesy detailed graphics. It's great. I didn't own or play Bansi when it originally released back in the day. It required an Amiga 1200 and its dreamy AGA chipset, and I was stuck with my worn-out A500. Now, I know that AGA was at best an iterative upgrade, but back then, to my oblivious teenage self, it seemed like a huge step up capable of competing with PC's VGA graphic cards on all fronts. It was hardly the case, however, but it's something for the computer history textbooks and not this video. What it was, though, is an interesting time in home computing, when the tides turned and it began to be painfully obvious that Amiga lost all of its competitive edge. Gaming started turning into 3D, and Commodore's machines' custom chips were just not built for that. At all. Anyway, I'm rambling, let's get back to our game at hand. Bansi was one of the games that didn't care about 3D, and placed all its proverbial chips on a good old classic 2D vertical shooting action. And it was an excellent bet. And also a win. Sure, it may have come out a bit late, but it represented the shoot 'em up genre like a boss. The graphics were a pure explosion of 16-bit eye candy goodness. Beautifully crafted in a mix of steampunk and World War II style, all drowning in various shades of brown. To highlight set influences, no doubt. A true sight to behold, even if few years too late to the party. And no wonder, as it was made by Core Design. And any former Amiga owner will tell you that their games not only looked incredible, but also had that very specific, easily distinguishable from others' graphic style that was just unmistakable. I mean, they were one of the first, if not the first Amiga developer that broke the 256 colors barrier on the basic 1MB OCS ECS system, something that designers of the Amiga themselves deemed impossible. And yet, Core Design made it happen. Anyway, what's worth mentioning, since we're already on the presentation, is that sheer amount and variety of enemies and potential innocent victims on the screen at once, all smoothly animated and complemented by neat little death/destruction animations. Bansi may have run at 25 FPS only, but it was filled to the brim with neat little graphical touches, details that many will never notice unless studying the game up close. It was incredible. Sounds, however, aside from few little enjoyable bits here and there like death screams and explosions, are nothing to write home about. They're workable, but in the end, that's all you could really expect from a shoot-em-up. Bansi is an excellent game, worth owning, and if that's not possible, then at least worth playing, even if emulated. Base Jumpers is a weird action platformer. Not weird because how it's played, though the premise is very unusual and not something I've seen in any other title, but because of how black and white it is, with no grey to it, so to speak. Meaning it's incredible, super fun and hella addicting when played with others, and in the same time, boring and uninspired when played alone. It may just be me, but for me it's exactly how it feels. Like a game made to be a party title that there's absolutely no reason to touch when you're alone. If you disagree, make sure to let me know in the comments below. Base Jumpers can be played by a maximum of 4 players, and while it's not necessary, a 2 is a minimum, a low bar necessary to enjoy it. The game is played in buildings, and each is unique, located in a different geographical locale and has to be climbed. Climb is a big and not necessarily well-fitting word, so let me clear that up. You have to scale them from the very bottom to the top in this genuinely unique vertically scrolling platformer, as fast as you can, against the clock, preferably with all your lives and energy intact. All the buildings are filled with thematically appropriate enemies patrolling, and you have to either avoid them or dispose of them Mario style, by jumping on their heads. Which, if you really think about it, is extremely violent, because not only you're breaking in the building, but also jumping on heads of those who do their job trying to stop you. It got dark quickly, so better ignore the last 2 or 3 sentences. While you fight your way up defeating enemies, every now and then they will drop a letter, and these have to be picked up and arranged in 3-letter combinations to receive bonuses. These are different and aplenty and can range from points through extra lives all the way to the special bonus stages. When you finally reach the top, it's time when the game's title will begin to make sense, because you're gonna give it justice by base jumping off the building. Regardless how many people actually play the game, there's always 4 jumpers, and the CPU takes control of these that are not human. As you fall down, gaining velocity rapidly, you need to dodge flagpoles and overhands and avoid being pushed into them by your fellow base jumpers. Or enemy base jumpers, I should say, really, cause clearly they do not wish you any good. Your aim is to reach the ground first, intact, which in multiplayer is not as easy as it sounds, but also where most of the fun of the game comes from. If you have someone else to play it with, I can wholeheartedly recommend base jumpers, but if you're alone, then it's not really worth your time, I'm afraid. Following the universally beloved and not exclusive original, the Chaos Engine 2 is a simultaneous 2-player top-down arcade shooter, and sadly, nowhere near as good of a game as the first was. Don't get me wrong though, it's not a bad one whatsoever, it's just way below the expectations of gamers after the incredible first outing. This time our 4 heroes are trapped in time, after Matt Baron Fortesque's Chaos Engine, a pretty cool name for a time machine I must add, broke down. And to get back to the original time, they have to work with and for the Baron to help him rebuild the contraption. The catch is, whomever helps him more will be rewarded with a trip back home, while the other will remain forever forgotten in endless strands of time. So, while in the first game both players work cooperatively, in Chaos Engine 2 they actually compete against each other. There's 4 characters to choose from, and they differ not only in how they look, but also weapons. As usual with those multiplayer ROMs, Chaos Engine 2 is considerably more fun when played with a person and not CPU. So make sure to have someone with you ready to pick up a gun and shoot some buddies. And slash or you. Yeah. The aim of each level is theoretically very simple, to pick up as many bonus points as humanly possible and find the key that will allow you to leave the level through exit before your opponent does. Now, how's that helpful with rebuilding the time machine? I will never understand, but it is what it is. I think that it's obvious that unlike first game, which was in large part about exploration and overcoming obstacles, working together towards the same goal, Chaos Engine 2 is an arena shooter. Beautifully designed, richly detailed and polished one, but arena shooter nonetheless. so all the typical strategies to this apply to it too, meaning you can hunt for your opponent actively, guns blazing, or you can ignore him and focus on completing the level as soon as you can, or even camp somewhere, seemingly doing nothing, waiting for him to show up, just to down him when he least expects it, and pick up whatever he collected and drop dying, and anything in between. Like I said initially, Chaos Engine 2 is not a bad game at all. It's just literally not what the fans of the first one wanted. They hoped for more of the same and got the opposite. If you like the first, I can't tell you how to feel about the second. You just gotta try it. But if you didn't, then it may be worth a go, provided you have someone else to play it against. The Citadel was what I called my bedroom when I was in high school, because it was locked off and nothing even remotely fun happened in there. Pretty sad, but true. But the Citadel that we'll talk about today came out in the same year behind the Iron Gate date that we spoke about just a few minutes ago, but other than sharing the same FPS roots, these two games felt as if they were at least a generation apart. Maybe two. Nearly everything that Behind the Iron Gate dropped the ball on, the Citadel did, and did well too. So it featured texture-mapped graphics, large lush levels with a lot to discover and a plethora of enemies to fight against, or run from, depending what weapon you were armed with and if you had enough ammo. And trust me, the firefights were brutal, the enemies were deadly, and the Citadel felt like Doom. Granted, a cut-down version of Doom, but all the makings of the great title were emulated accurately in their own unique way. The atmosphere of being alone, trapped in a remote base filled with countless unspeakable alien horrors is nailed in this one, and feeling that you have no one else there with you to help you escape it was overwhelming. Sure, many technically better FPSs released on the Amiga within the next few years, but hardly any could compare in the atmosphere to the Citadel. It was the first real Doom clone on the system, and it was fun. And that's the most important thing about it, because while I can excuse a lot when it comes to the presentation when the game is fun, when it's not, it really doesn't matter how it looks. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Fears. The Citadel, like most early Amiga FPSs, does not show an on-screen weapon. It's a pity, but given everything else that it offers, it can be forgiven. Especially that it runs on all Amigas provided they have at least 1 MB of RAM. Sure, on A500 it ran in a window that couldn't be compared to anything else than the postal stamp, but it ran and was entirely playable, start to finish. And also, who hasn't played the FPS in a window 1/10 of the entire screen size, never played an Amiga FPS. It's an experience like no other, period. Oh, and the intro sequence to the Citadel is just phenomenal. It's beautifully pre-rendered, sci-fi themed, and even features some very basic FMV sequences. Yeah, on Amiga, in a disc-based game. If you wanna see first real FPS on the Amiga, this is the one to track down. A little earlier, I mentioned I tend to slip in mentions of Benefactor whenever I can, like now, here, a few minutes after we just spoke about it. But the number of times I talk about Deluxe Galaga easily dwarfs it. And no wonder, cause what I'm about to say is gonna be a bold, courageous statement, perhaps a little stupid too, and also one I will defend until the day I die. Deluxe Galaga is bar none the single best vertically scrolling shoot 'em up on the Amiga, and second best in existence out of all platforms, classic or otherwise. Only bettered by Warblade, made by the same developer on PC years later. Yeah, you may jump in the comments now, to let me know why you mistakenly think that I'm wrong. And yes, I realize that from the presentation stance, it has literally nothing to offer. It looked very dated when it released, it looks dated now, and it will even more so with each passing year. The sounds and music are also nothing to ponder about, they're there, they do their job, and are no better than in any other generic shooter. So, there's nothing more really that could be said about its presentation. Well, unless it's something like backgrounds in Deluxe Galaga are as dark and empty as my darkest thoughts every day when I wake up and think about the grim future. Or maybe something similar to most sprites in the game are as small and insignificant as my bank account balance. Or something down the lines of Snake on the Nokia phone had better sounds than this one does. You get the gist. It's not praiseworthy in this department whatsoever. But it's irrelevant, cause it shines the most, kinda like that bald spot you've been polishing with that questionable cream every day in hopes for it spawning a single hair or two, when it comes to playability. While based on original Galaga, it adds so much to the formula that it ends up being an original, unique experience that's much better played than watched or listened about. It features 75 levels, but completing them all does not end the game, just circles back to the first at increased speed and difficulty, so you can carry on ramping up the points forever until it's humanly impossible to go any further. Said levels are divided into smaller parts of 3 consecutive waves. First two being sort of introductions to new kinds of enemies, their attack patterns and capabilities, and third being a small bosses challenge in the theme of the first two. We used to call those mini-bosses mothers back in the day, as they were just bigger, stronger and more resistant versions of the basic enemies. All these are interluded by alternating bonus or kamikaze stages. Earlier are risk-free levels for points and bonus upgrades, latter are high-risk, high-reward waves of kamikaze enemy attacks, in which they drop on you quickly and are rather difficult to beat if you've not upgraded your weapons. As you play the game, you'll also be triggering bonus memory lane and meteor storm stages. The first is a basic game of memory, but with a twist that all the pairs that you manage to find are actually bonuses and add-ons for your ship. Second sees you navigating a fast-falling and filled with bonuses indestructible meteors against the clock. The faster and further you get, the more points you will accumulate. Completing this incredibly punishing stage also rewards a lot of money, that then can be later on spent in the shop to purchase very powerful weapons. So having beat it early on can pretty much guarantee a successful run. Every 25 levels you encounter a huge boss that is considerably more demanding and dangerous than anything before, and it will require memorization of its attack and movement patterns and ninja-like dexterity to beat it. Naturally, approaching this with basic or low power weapons is a recipe for failure and a shortcut to death. And you know what? Everything I told you about is just scratching the surface, as there's not only much more to Deluxe Galaga, but also a whole plethora of secrets that can make the game easier and more fun, provided you discover them, that is. But you'll just have to play it to experience it, and not just take my word for it. Deluxe Galaga is so feature-rich that it never gets stale, and while looking like a tiny little itty-bitty step-up in presentation to 8-bit original, it's actually incredibly fun and addicting game for 1 or 2 players. Cooperatively or alternating, however you wanna play it, it's easily a title worth a whole evening of gaming. It's not very often that the best game in a genre on the Amiga comes from a small developer, from a country that was not well known for great games, and all that at the very tail end of system's life. And here, that's precisely the case. Doman is a game that has a lot of issues, starting with constant load times that are a nightmare. Disk drive seems to be in an overdrive between each and every group of enemies, or like a bus length or half whale of walking distance on the screen. The game keeps loading something all the freaking time. And if it wouldn't have came out in 1995, I would have sworn that it just keeps making a local copy of the internet on floppies. Then there's the graphics. And I'll give them that, they have their own unique charm, but they're also a definition of cringe. And finally, the game's in Polish only. I mean, no one cares about the story in a walking beat-em-ups, but if you're an exception confirming that rule, then you're not gonna understand anything, as Doman never received an English version. And since it's 2023, we can safely assume that it never will. All that aside, it's a unique and very well put together title. A medieval-themed low fantasy beat-em-up that's best known for its abundance of blood and gore, all the bodybuilders, LARPing Conan the Barbarian and the likes, and muscles in places you never knew muscles could exist. Granted, I'm no doctor or PE teacher and have no deep understanding of a human body, so perhaps a double bicep is just fine. Then there are 2 characters to choose from, or players in co-op for that matter. And both of these medieval Slavic beefcakes that the players can lead have variety of different attacks that are also weapon dependent, meaning each weapon has a set of their own attack and finisher animations, and they can be exchanged at various specific points during gameplay, so you'll have plenty enough time to try them all out and find your favorites. In the end, Doman is a surprisingly playable title that no one expected to be good at all. And perhaps because of that, since there were no overwhelming expectations for it to reach any particular milestones or have certain features, it managed to do its own thing and in the process become one of the better original exclusive beat-em-ups on the Amiga. It also uses any additional hardware you can throw at it, so the faster CPU and more RAM you'll have, the better it will look, sound and run. So, if you're into the genre, or just want to lose few minutes cutting heads off or bashing bodies, and don't mind the immersion-breaking loading, it's an excellent title for that purpose. Some of you know of my hate towards body blows games, for how empty and a shell of the games that they are, offering very little to anyone who's ever played a real good versus fighter. And Mania? Well, it's an interesting case of same but different, but we'll circle back to it in a minute. Story-wise, the king of Mumulandia is ready to step down and find a worthy successor, but leading the kingdom of elves is an honor, and only the one quote-unquote worthy can do so. So, he decides that whomever defeats him in combat will not only be worthy, but also powerful enough to lead and defend the elves if the need ever occurs. In Mania, you're not bound to stick into a single fighter, and with enough money earned during fights for successful attacks, you can purchase other, seemingly better ones and switch to them. And while all of the available characters look entirely different, they actually kinda play samey. I mean, sure, the more expensive fighters do actually hit stronger, but you don't really play them any different than you would have those that you start with. At least I don't. And perhaps I've been playing the game wrong all along. Feel free to correct me in the comments. All that sadly means that the recipe for success is to keep fighting weak opponents, saving up money for better fighters, then doing the exact same thing with the better ones until you get to the best, and only then to challenge the king. Perhaps it's a fresh take on the fighter formula, but it's not very fun and very grindy. So yeah, if you feel like I was trying to tell you that Elf Mania is boring and not very fun, you got my intentions just right. But despite all that, just look at it. It's a beauty. And how smooth it runs. It's a testament to what the system was capable of with great graphic artists and top-of-the-class programmers. Because clearly that's who Elf Mania had on the roster. If it only had a decent game designer, then perhaps we'd end up with a fun and beautiful game on our hands and not just an Amiga's graphics capabilities show-off. I won't recommend playing Elf Mania to you today, as it's not great. But if it's a toss between it and Body Blows, always, and I mean it, always go for a different game and not Body Blows. Deathmask is a 1 or 2 player first-person shooter that I played a lot with a buddy of mine back in the day and had tons of fun doing so, which is odd as it's really a flawed product. But I suppose everything's better with a friend. Especially that was only sort of first-person shooter and we were very hungry for this to run on our Amigas. Deathmask can be played in 3 modes: single player, cooperative 2 player, and the only mode that is somewhat playable, 2 player versus deathmatch. The first 2 are boring, and I mean it, the enemies look samey and everything is brown. There's brown all around. The levels are not great for a PvE campaign either, being identically looking and illogical mazes, and the way the game operates make you feel at constant disadvantage. It's not the case though, as it's not one of the most difficult shooters out there, but it just feels wrong. 2 player versus is where it shines. Sure, the screen is split vertically, so both of you see each other's locations, but we used to divide them between us with a makeshift wall made out of empty folders, pizza boxes, anything that would do the job, and just go hunting for one another, finding weapons, power-ups, and listening to any and all sounds of steps. Which was often misleading, I must add, as you never knew if you heard your friend approaching or he you. But whatever, it was fun. But why was this mode playable and single player and co-op wasn't? Because of a very specific design choice that the developers of the Deathmask made. Which you've been watching for the last minute or so, and it ultimately made the game only playable in short bursts with a friend once every full moon. Namely the way the graphics are displayed. Rather than trying to imitate Doom that it clearly wanted to be, Deathmask picked something between it and older step-by-step dungeon crawling RPGs. A middle ground that sadly was not something that worked very well. So your character moved in step-by-step format and turned by 90 degrees only, and not smoothly, which is not only a little annoying but also disorienting if you're more used to shooters than classic RPGs. In the same time, the combat is real-time like in all shooters and not turn-based. It's weird and out of place, and the game doesn't know where it should stick to, is what I'm saying. Deathmask really wanted to be Deathmatch Doom, but for whatever the reason couldn't commit fully to the idea. Be it because of a need to rush the game to the market or lack of know-how by the programmers, the reasons are as unknown as it is unimportant today. All in all, it failed to deliver. Graphics are very simple and rather disappointing, especially that a lot of processing power was freed by not having a movement run fluidly. And Deathmask, with its couple of frames of animation per character and brown on even more brown with splash of brown presentation, just looks bland and boring. Sounds, however, are actually something worth highlighting. On a good sound system, they're loud and appropriately meaty to what's happening on the screen. I know that there's no such word, but that's how I see them. The ratatatas, the kapows, and all the booms are as I'd like them to be. Play it or not, whatever you decide, don't do it alone. I promise you that not all games in this video are bad, and that there are some even exceptional ones covered, but Forest Dump, sadly, is no better than Deathmask. But let's start at the beginning and not get ahead of ourselves. It's a Polish-budget side-scrolling platformer that on the first glance looks as if it was trying to convey a similar feeling and offer comparable gameplay mechanics to Team 17's masterpiece, Super Frog. Naturally, it fails on all fronts. Whatever was the element that made Super Frog such a magical and beloved title is entirely missing in Forest Dump. Sure, it scrolls smoothly, the sprites are not bad and backgrounds are pretty good too, but it just does not compare to the pixel perfection the frog offered. Also, the main character's animation is so unnatural that it's unsettling to watch in a weird way. And the more you play the game, the more you get into it, you begin to notice and realize that some levels are nearly carbon copies of this font in Super Frog, short of most of secret passages, hidden spots, environmental puzzles and atmosphere. I mean, just by looking at parts of them I can tell you where a hidden tunnel should be or a stashed away coin cache in Super Frog. All based solely on the level design. That's how one-to-one parts of particular stages are. To complete the level you have to collect a certain number of coins for the exit to open, surprise surprise, and there are fruits to collect for points. They don't really serve any other purpose. All that within a allotted time limit. Same as in original though, it shouldn't be too difficult as it's there only to make sure that you don't leave the game unattended for too long. Stages are rather large and full of various bodies, stationary or otherwise. Most of them you can kill by jumping on their heads, but spikes are deadly and one hit you, so should definitely be avoided if only possible. Music, other than the terrible track in the menu, is non-existent and there's literally maybe 6 or 7 sound samples in the whole game. If you tell me that the devs had a budget of $1,000 and a crate of beer to make Forest Dump, I wouldn't consider it improbable. Finally, the difficulty, or lack thereof. Because other than the spikes, the game is so easy, a 5-year-old could probably complete it with some lives left and a lot of time to spare. And it's not even a joke. If Super Frog never existed, Forest Dump could be considered a slightly below average generic late Amiga platformer. But since it's obvious how much unsuccessfully it copies everything from Team 17's game and fails miserably at it, the best score I could give it is terrible. Don't play it unless you're a hardcore platformer fan and just have to sample them all. I promised you a good game and here's one. Foundation Gold. Nothing to do with Apple TV series and Isaac Asimov's sci-fi series of books. A lot to do with Blue Byte Settlers though, as it's Amiga's spiritual successor to the first game and answer to PC's second outing in the long-running Settlers series. So, Foundation Gold is just that. A kingdom management game that's kinda like Settlers 2, but also a bit more and a bit less in the same time. I know, confusing. Let me explain. Gold version is a compilation of the basic game and its add-on, offering a whopping 80 missions to challenge even the most hardcore fans of the original. Sure, they're mostly all very similar, barring small differences in opponents, map topography and access to resources, but same could be said about missions in Settlers. While some basics are identical between the games, so you have to gather resources, erect specialized buildings, and there's 20 of these here, and also make sure that your citizens are well fed, some things are different, namely roads, which are not a necessity for resource delivery and for Kingdom to function here. There are more specialized units in Foundation too, like maidens, which are women quote-unquote used for breeding. And it sounds bad regardless how you think about it, so excuse me for that. Then wizards, that can use magic for some truly ungodly treatment of the dead, to erect buildings that is. And peasants that can be trained into various other positions but can also acquire some skills for themselves, like arson as a method of attack for instance. All these make for a novel feeling, even if largely very similar gameplay experience. Foundation's presentation is excellent, everything runs in high resolution, is multicolored and really pleasant to the eye. Sounds and music are very good too and round up the whole gold package nicely. That said, all that comes at a price. And in this particular case, it's the system requirements, which are incredibly high for Amiga, but given that the game came out in 2000, also understandable. The absolute basic is 68030 CPU with 6 MB of RAM and AGA chipset, but that provides for a rather choppy, unsatisfying experience. 68040 or even better 68060 with 8 megs and Picasso graphics card is what you realistically need to play it comfortably. Or, and that's what I would suggest, use the best Amiga on the market. So any PC you can get your hands on. Cause any machine from the last decade should be able to emulate the Amiga and run Foundation at full speed with ease. I've praised the game for quite a while now, so let me tell you what I don't like about it. And there are a couple of minor things that grind my gears a little. For one, complete omission of the cute small animations that Settlers were full of, like constructing buildings plank by plank and brick by brick or chopping down the trees. You get what I'm saying, right? Things that made Settlers special and enchanting, the attention to the pixel in size detail every step of the way. And it's missing. Don't get me wrong, Foundation is excellent, just not as good as the game it's based on. And given the choice, I'd always rather play Settlers 2 Gold on PC. Hero Quest II Legacy of Sorasil is a turn-based top-down isometric fantasy tactical party role-playing, a follow-up to the first game, and the single longest described game in this video within the first sentence of its preview. Oh my god, the grammar gods are furious after hearing this, I'm sure of it. And they would definitely strike me from heavens if I only believed in gods, that is. Anyway, while the Hero Quest system itself may be mechanically pretty simple, the included 9 scenarios are really challenging and will no doubt provide fans of role-playings with hours of fun and demanding action. Legacy of Sorasil reminds me of 2 role-playing board games that I play with buddies of mine semi-regularly, namely Gloomhaven and Descent, with a difference that it's slightly limited in scale, as these 2 can be enjoyed for months with the amount of content that they offer. So if you're familiar with them, you'll feel right at home at Hero Quest 2. Story-wise, unexpectedly, the land of Raya begins to fall in ruin. The rivers dry out, fields are dead and give no crop, and people are leaving their homes looking for new, more fertile lands. All that's missing to round up the despair are the armies of darkness, but these tend to closely follow the death of the lands themselves too, so time is of essence before it'll be too late for Ria. Your friend, Alamon the Mystic, sends you a magical letter pleading for help. You're to travel around the surrounding kingdoms to find mystical artifacts, recover them and bring them back to him, where with help of his magic they will allow him to save the kingdom from destruction. And that's what you'll be doing, seeking the artifacts that will be used in Ria's salvation. At the start of the game you have to create your 4-man party for the campaign, choosing between Wizard, Ranger, Barbarian, Dwarf, Elf, Paladin, Cleric and Mystic. All have their strengths and weaknesses, and creating a balanced party for your playstyle is a must. The game revolves in turns and uses action points as a basis for that. They're utilized for everything, from walking through searching and opening doors all the way to attacking and casting spells. And while it's pretty simple to grasp how everything works, it's best that you master it all fast, as each consecutive mission is more demanding. Unlike the first game, the missions are not standalone and form a campaign, and can take anything from 45 to 90 minutes on average to complete each. So while there's only 9 of them overall, they're much longer than in the predecessor. In between them you'll be able to visit the shop to sell found treasures and old gear, and to purchase new better equipment too. Oh, and a little hint from me, since you'll often need to split up and may be attacked at any point really, not all combat encounters have to be resolved then and there. It's sometimes smarter to run away until you get to where you could rejoin with your other team members so that you could face the enemy as a group. It's not always possible obviously, but when it is, it's best to try to go for strength in numbers approach. The graphics and sounds are fantastic, and if you happen to play Hero Quest 2 on CD32, then the music is phenomenal too. Legacy of Sarasil looks and plays like a tactical role-playing board game, and a pretty good one at that. So if you enjoy these or like RPGs on home systems at all, it's definitely an interesting choice for a fun afternoon or two. Legion is a mutant, a son of Charles Xavier, and one suffering from multiple personalities disorder. Each of these displays entirely different mutant abilities, and since he's usually portrayed as anti-hero or villain even, it's a problem, cause some of them are really powerful. But Legion, that we'll talk about today, is something entirely different. It's a Polish, rather obscure turn-based strategy with role-playing elements, or role-playing game with strategic overtones. Depends how you wanna look at it. You start with 5 characters that can come from 9 different races and are described by 6 statistics: strength, energy, speed, resistance, magic and experience. Perhaps not a D&D staple, but mix of stats that we've grown accustomed to over the years anyway. You can buy gear for each of your party members and it will increase their stats. As it does in typical RPGs, your team may be controlled as a whole or as individual units. The game's played in 2 modes. In first, you can check and adjust your equipment between the characters, upgrade your controlled settlements and form new legions. In second, you control each unit separately, traveling and experiencing the world. I mentioned earlier that we're giving a freedom of choice how to enjoy the game, and while it's only twofold, it's surprisingly different in gameplay styles. In general, the game is about raising your powers, and you can approach it in 2 ways. First, more peaceful, where you travel around the map, visit various towns, engage in conversations with NPCs, trade, and often pick up while meeting people singular or even whole chains of quests. So it's a united federation of planets' approach to expanding your sphere of influence, through peaceful means and cooperation with met groups and individuals. My kind of way. Second road to victory, however, is through blood and tears, through combat, through spying, tax levels management in your settlements, and rivalry against 3 other leaders aiming for the win. So Klingon/Cardassian way, war, espionage and betrayal. It's odd how these Star Trek references fit in the game's description perfectly, even though it's set in high fantasy medieval times, isn't it? Legion never received the recognition it deserved, but I suppose it's the release date that is to blame for it. While the game was of Polish origin, it was available in English too, but 1996 was not a year many Amiga users were still out there looking for new titles to play. So despite its qualities, Legion was doomed from the start. Kinda like Dr. Doom's plans are whenever he faces Fantastic Four. Oh my god, what's with all the references? I gotta stop, it's getting us nowhere. Liberation Captive 2 is a dark cyberpunk role-playing game and a sequel to 1990's Captive. I think I've covered Captive in one of my earlier videos, one of the 10 years of Amiga and 10 years of DOS gaming ones. So if you want to learn more about it, you can check it out there. They should both say more or less the same, as there weren't many differences between the 2 versions. Anyway, Liberation is a futuristic free-roam open-ended RPG, and from the get-go it was designed to be a CD32 game, as it featured long beautiful cutscenes, plenty of voice acting and CD-quality soundtrack. And if there were more games like that, perhaps CD32 wouldn't have failed as a console as bad as it did. Later, base Amiga outing came on 5 floppies and was stripped down version of CD-based original. Even though it was as playable as the CD32 version, it lacked CD-based music and many of the sound effects. So if you have a choice, always go for the CD32 port, it's just superior. Liberation takes place in a huge, fully explorable city with hundreds upon hundreds of accessible buildings, something that was not done before, at least not on the Amiga. In a way, the City of Liberation is more open and free to explore than many open-world games of today are. I mean, comparing it to similarly themed Watch Dogs Legion released a year or so ago, where 95% of all buildings are facades, Liberation looks like a much bigger and better designed title, given Amiga's capabilities, that is. That's not all, however. Pretty much every feature you'll see in the city is either interactive or can be used in some way, starting from taxis to buildings of various kinds actually offering services that they would in real life. You play as Trill, the protagonist of the previous game, and this time a free man. But there wouldn't be much of a game if there was no conflict, right? So, as free as you are also witness to a rather brutal killing of a quote-unquote witness by the police robots. And you're also seemingly the only one realizing that it's not an isolated event, but something that's happening on a daily basis. So you take it upon yourself to uncover the conspiracy, free all the innocent captives, at least those that are still alive, and survive, as someone who knows too much is definitely not someone whose well-being is in the interest of the establishment. Liberation is a huge game, and a very unique one at that. And if I had to describe it to someone using other titles, I'd say it's a mix between GTA, Deus Ex, with a touch of Morrowind for good measure. It's an experience like no other is what I'm saying here, and that it's very easy to get lost in the world of Liberation. In a good way, that is. Lionheart is a fantasy action platformer, where you play as He-Man, Conan the Barbarian, Lion-O from Thundercats, or a mixture of all three in one protagonist. And only one of these four is potentially correct. Sorta. It's also a game that many of the former Amiga owners used to show off their system's capabilities to PC and Atari ST gamers. I mean, what was possible with just 1 MB of RAM on a very basic A500 was uncanny. It was a true technological achievement. It ran like a charm on this very simple configuration too, offering incredibly detailed and enchantingly smooth animations with no slowdowns, and multi-level parallax scrolling backgrounds that looked like something straight out of fantasy book cover. Now, if you ever seen Shadow of the Beast, another show-off type of the game, you know that while it looks incredible, it plays as fun as it is to play with 2 bricks and a stick with dog's poo at the end of it. So not very. But Lionheart, oh my days, it's a package alright. It's a really enjoyable and engaging experience that's actually unlike aforementioned Beast, not crippled by the constantly respawning enemies, blunt and repeatable gameplay, and unclear direction. It's fantastic. Let's start at the beginning though. You play as Valden, a beautiful name indeed. And I think that in Latin it means a friend of the turtle. Don't quote or fact check me on that though. And you've been unfairly imprisoned. Why? Who cares? You have, and that cannot stand. The king, however, gives you an opportunity to prove your innocence and regain freedom by seeking out and recovering his stolen holy jewel, the titular Lionheart. Naturally, you agree, cause if you wouldn't, we'd have no game to play. The levels are varied and interesting too, and even using a very unique approach to difficulty. If you pick a higher tier of it, they may not only feature more challenging enemies but also slightly redesigned and expanded environments, changing the level's layout a little. Lionheart is an excellent proof that Amiga could offer a quality console-like platformers. And if there's one thing I don't particularly like about it, it's the controls. They take time to get used to, and for some it may be seriously discouraging. But when you finally do master them, there's a lot of fun to be had here. As depicted in a beautifully animated introduction sequence, you're awakened by the phone call from your angry boss. Apparently the film reels you've been working on are missing, and your competition is to blame for it. So you do whatever's to do in these types of situations when one happens to be a video game protagonist, so you set off to recover them. Premiere is a movie-themed action platformer in which you're invading the competing movie studio to recover 6 of your films, each lost on a different thematically set. These are Wild West Western, science fiction, cartoon, horror, black and white comedy, and I'm not sure what the last genre is supposed to represent, but it's different to the first 5. Each of these sets features appropriately designed for it enemies, decorations and music, so you are always feeling like you are part of a different movie, so to speak. All of these sets also have backdoors, upon entering which you move into the backstage section, so a world of scaffolds, props and film cameras. It too is full of enemies, so while it provides a variety of gameplay, it definitely does not offer you a breather. Interestingly enough, all the weapons that you can find and pick up are always well fitting within the theme of the set that you're in. Whenever a particular level is completed, before you can recover the missing film reel, you must act out a scene from the movie in a unique and short minigame. They are all different to one another, not only presentation-wise, but even in terms of their genre, so this definitely prolonged the replayability of Premiere considerably. as more often than not they can be more fun than the main game is. While technically speaking the platforming sections of Premiere are rather generic and nothing special, gameplay-wise when compared to a sea of other Amiga platformers, the ever-changing themes, minigames and backstage section make it to be an unusual one-of-a-kind platformer. Perhaps not the best on the system, far from it in fact, but definitely one among the most memorable. It's worth pointing out that Premiere's graphics are phenomenal. All sprites are large and super smoothly animated, looking as if they were literally torn out of the cartoon of some sort. And all that on superb and incredibly detailed backgrounds. Premiere is a dictionary example of an exclusive title. Not only it did not release on any other platform, but also there's no other game like it on Amiga itself. Dang it, there's Oscar. By 1995, most Western developers were releasing either their last or penultimate games on the Amiga, but the system was still very popular and with a steady user base in the East, in recently independent former Eastern Bloc countries like Poland or Lithuania. And since I'm hailing from one of them, I can first-hand confirm that that was the case. And the developers there did not plan on abandoning the system anytime soon. At least not how Menbat's parents did him by selfishly dying at the hands of a random robber. How inconsiderate. I'm Batman! Okay, sorry Bruce, that went too far. Looks like I've upset him. It's nothing that the cake, therapy and some alcohol can't cure though. Anyway, the devs in the Central Eastern Europe still saw Amiga as a very capable, popular and most importantly potentially profitable platform. So abandoning it would be a mistake with such a huge and still hungry for new releases user base. Enter Lost in Mind, a puzzle platformer by a Polish developer Wookiesoft. At first glance it may not look like much, but looks are often deceiving and Lost in Mind is the case of that exactly. It's an excellent, even if at the time mind-boggling puzzler with a very simple premise at heart. All you have to do is get to the exit. Simple as that. But it's not the destination, it's the journey. And it's that journey that is what's great and challenging about it. Unlike many other games in the genre, Lemmings or Humans for instance, you don't pick actions from a list of skills or buttons, you have to platform your way out of the level using various installations and machines spread in strategic locations around it. And they can be any and all mining equipment from simple drills and lifts through harvesters to even explosives among others. Some controlled manually, other remotely at distance. Oh, and don't get discouraged by the fact that Lost in Mind released in Polish only, as other than the title screen you won't really see it anywhere else. At least not in any meaningful way. It's not very often that I get to speak about truly unique and innovative titles. I often do about one of the two, but rarely both, and Lost in Mind is just that. It's hella fun if you enjoy puzzle games, and if you also like platformers, it's even more so. If you get a chance, definitely check it out. When Perihelion the Prophecy came out, I was 12, perhaps 13. While not a kid anymore and already heavily invested into RPGs, I wasn't prepared for it. And even though I tried approaching it numerous times, I always somehow end up bouncing off of it and landing with another game in my disk drive. Perhaps it was the initial difficulty or the brown-greyish tones of everything in its presentation, or simply me not being mature enough to fully encompass and understand what I had been given a chance to experience. And even though now dark, gritty and cyberpunkish aesthetics of Perihelion would be my dream world to visit in a game, I never completed it. And based on the amount of games I'm interested in that are released yearly, chances are I never will. That's one of the biggest failures of my personal gaming history. Still, since I've spent long enough on myself, let's talk a little about Perihelion itself. You're in charge of 6 characters, whose races are an odd and very intimate amalgamations of human and different animal and mechanical entities. And you have to save the realm that you live in from an evil being that's slowly materializing into your dimension. Even more so, as it's foretold to bring a terrorizing end to it. The game is viewed from the first-person perspective when traversing, with battle sequences playing out in tactical top-down view, in turn-based mode. Quite unique, at least for the time, was the skill leveling system that raised those most used faster than the others. It's something that we've seen in numerous games since, especially in those from early Bethesda, but back then, and on the Amiga, it was not common. Perihelion is one of those games that I've never seen a single negative review for, and that's definitely something worth mentioning. Cause even if I never completed it, it's gotta speak to its quality in terms of both story and strategic combat encounters. Dropping an omnipresent and milked to death by the early 90s fantasy D&D formula for a darker and entirely new cyber RPG system in Perihelion should be a recipe for its success. And yet, somehow, despite all the building blocks being in the right places, it never reached the popularity it deserved and remained a rather unknown, even if unique, Amiga exclusive. If you like RPGs, especially those sci-fi cyberpunk-like ones, and enjoy turn-based tactical combat, and on top of that have a lot of free time to sink into something, Perihelion is definitely an excellent pick. If you ever wondered how a budget version of Lotus Turbo Challenge would look like, wonder no more. I'm here to show you. In fact, I'll show you how the discounted budget rushed low quality version would end up looking. Ride przez Polskę, which roughly translates to a race through Poland, is a 1996 arcade racer that sees you driving from one end of Poland to another, with individual routes connecting country's major cities, all within the allotted time limit. While the background graphics between the stages change a little, they don't feel very imaginative and are rather simple and bland. Same can be said about the on-road traffic. There's only 3 different kinds of cars that you'll ever get to pass by, and they're the same ones that you can pick to drive yourself. And these are popular in Poland in the late 80s and early 90s: Fiat Cinquecento, Fiat 126p, and Polo Nescaro. And if you haven't heard of some of these, it's because they were, well, at least one of them was, nearly entirely exclusive to Poland, and not sold anywhere else. And while they're all anything but fancy, they do have certain charm to them. In reality, that is. Anyway, while it's an interesting choice of vehicles, I mean, you would not typically see cars like that in standard racers, they were hardly machines that anyone would correlate with racing, with mostly tiny engines and low bhp. It could obviously be argued that the game was based on an earlier title, namely Cross Country Road Race, and was supposed to be a racer as well as teach geography of Poland. But quite honestly, while the subject itself may be interesting to some, the way this game presented it was beyond dull. In short, Ride przez Polskę sounds bad, looks terrible and plays mid. It's not a game I would recommend to anyone other than the avid racing fan, so that they could just add it to their collection and keep boxed unwrapped forever and ever. All that said, while not great, it's also nowhere near the worst racer that I've played. And I can understand and appreciate the melancholy factor it may serve to those who played it back in the day and those who hail from Poland. Personally, I don't care much about it today. I'm not sure when exactly it was or how long it ran for, but sometime in the 2000s there was this show called Pimp My Ride. Now, objectively speaking, it wasn't great, though I found it eerily enchanting and would devour every episode that was running if I only happened to be watching TV when it was on. And since back then I did actually still watch TV, I've seen a few. The premise was that they took those old beaten up cars and remade them fresh with new look, new interiors and filled them with tech to the brim. Overkill is that. A remade, pimped up Defender, covered with a fresh layer of multicolored paint and brought up to the technological capabilities of Amiga by 1993. Quite literally, other than the entire remade presentation, not much else has been added or changed. While Defender's gameplay formula was new and fun when it originally released in 1981, same gameplay mechanics with virtually no changes in 1993 were not as enchanting. I mean, sure, Overkill looked incredible, the colors spilled from every nook and cranny of the screen and the sounds were modernized and well-fitting. But I didn't want to play an early 80s game in the 90s. I wanted something new and flashy, not old and rehashed. And I suppose no one else did either, as Overkill was never as popular as the devs probably hoped that it would be. It's hard to wonder about its obscurity though, as not only it did nothing new, but also released on AGA systems only. This alone limited the game's potential player base to a very small subset of all Amiga owners. As highlighted initially, since the difference between Overkill and Defender are just in the presentation, you can bet that Overkill is as demanding as original it was copying is. It's through the roof difficult, to the point of being frustrating and not challenging. Well, perhaps not in the first couple levels, but the difficulty ramps up rapidly and it's not everyone's cup of tea. Certainly not mine, so I'm definitely not a fan. But let me make this perfectly clear. Overkill is not a bad game whatsoever. It was just dead on arrival, turnout of its time and too tough for its own good. Nemak 4 The Director's Cut is a renamed version of the original Nemak 4 released on CD and with an animated pre-rendered intro. Other than that, there are no differences to the year prior's disc-based version. Nemak 4 is a late Amiga sci-fi first-person shooter, and it was technical achievement on the system as it could theoretically run on any Amiga with at least 1 MB of RAM. Granted, approaching it with the most basic configuration was pointless and the game was an unplayable mess of ginormous pixels in a letter stamp-sized window, but it was doable. So the more power you can throw at it, the better it will look and run. That said, it can never really reach the heights of Alien Breed 3D2 or Genetic Species, but arguably these two were the best looking FPSs on the Amiga. Neither of them could be run on Amiga 500 though, so I suppose Nemak 4 wins on a technicality. I don't know what it wins exactly, but if there's a reward for it, it should get it. Anyway, the titular Nemak 4, according to the game's story, is a supercomputer located in a high-tech, well-secured underground bunker, and it's used to control all the automated military arsenal in the world. Stupid idea to leave it all in the quote-unquote hands of a single machine, but it's probably no worse than leaving it to humans. So, one of those days, when a routine simulation was running on it, something happened and it mistook the combat simulation for reality, assumed that its creators were the enemies and started gearing up for humanity's destruction, preparing all the world's tanks, trash-can-looking battle robots and nuclear weaponry alike. All the toys of destruction were at its disposal is what I'm saying. So, your aim in the game is to take a remotely controlled robot through 40 more and more demanding levels to eventually find and destroy Nimag 4's reactor core. On one hand, Nimag 4 looks great and the animated cutscenes were literally jaw-dropping for the time. On another, sound design is not great and the levels are rather boringly designed, all grain and samey all throughout the game. Though it has to be said that the first few are especially unimpressive as compared to the rest of the game. So while Nimag 4 is technically impressive and a good attempt at FPS on the Amiga, it is not very fun. Do whatever you please with that knowledge. Odyssey is an action platformer with some puzzle-solving elements released at the tail end of Amiga's commercial life. And it shows. It's beautiful, super smoothly scrolling, fluidly animated and has crazy good designed levels. It's just a pleasure to behold even on the most basic A500. It's not a pleasure to play though, for me at least, as it's quite challenging during all the combat encounters, especially in the earlier parts of the game. Others may enjoy it, and judging by the Lemon Amiga and Moby Games scores, they all do. But I just find it frustrating. It's not on the game though, it's on me. So don't base your opinion of it on my feelings alone. Story-wise, your uncle killed your father, the king, dick move I must add, and took the crown for himself. After a few long years in exile, you're finally ready to take back the throne and kill the treacherous usurper. He's not an elderly weakling though and surrounded by a literal army of his lackeys, so to be able to face him, you'll need to become powerful. Way more than you are when initially heading off on your adventure. To do so, you will need to find and claim the power of the crystals that are scattered all around the kingdom. You'll spend most of the game running around 7 huge always scrolling levels, platforming your way through the Metroidvania style, fighting your evil uncle's goons and solving various puzzles. Most of them are your typical find an object and bring it to the correct spot fair or opening locked off passages. The gimmick of the Odyssey is that you can morph into various animals, each of them with their own unique set of skills and abilities, and you will have to do that often to overcome some of the more challenging in-game sequences and to pass certain obstacles. What's most impressive about Odyssey, however, is that the developer, Audiogenic, were basically two guys who worked on the game with virtually no outside help. And what they ended up with, both technically and gameplay-wise, is short of magnificent, even if not for me. So while I don't love the game personally, I can definitely recommend that you try it out as most people find it incredible. Let's start with a short lesson. A lido is an old English word for an open-air swimming pool or fashionable beach resort. It's not something that I knew before researching the game for one of my earlier videos, and it's also not a word that I ever heard or used in a conversation. Yeah. Anyway, Hills Lido is a game that's really obscure and probably why it never left the Amiga, all because of how it was distributed, not because of its quality, which in fact is fantastic. Vulkan Software, the developer, never sold their games in shops, but rather advertised them in gaming mags and sold by mail order. And interestingly, all Vulkan games, apart from the famous Valhalla duology, were entirely different in terms of their themes and genres. It made for an interesting library and one worth tracking down if you're an Amiga collector. Anyway, coming back to Hills Lido, it's a seaside management sim not far off thematically from games like Theme Park. You start the game with £1 million and an empty beach and promenade to develop on. Your ultimate goal is obviously to earn as much money as possible, but to do so you have to create as attractive locales as you can. So you'll start with something simple like an eatery or a shop, you'll hire staff, set their wages, order supplies for your attractions, and finally set up prices for your wares or services. You will also need to keep the seaside clean, so you'll get the cleaners, someone to collect the money from all the businesses, and preferably a bodyguard to keep that fellow safe and make sure that he doesn't get mugged on his way back with all the hard-earned dough. Naturally, in time, some of your stalls may require repairing or maintenance, and there are people who can be paid to sort it all out too. A lifeguard is always a good idea, given how smart and responsible people are. So, do it all, do it well, and keep expanding, and you'll be on a straight road for the riches and to have a lot of fun playing Hills Lido. If you like business management and simulation games, Hills Lido is excellent and also quite funny at times. So check it out. Dragonstone is a sequel to Darkmere and a top-down fantasy action role-playing, and it looks amazing, with its very Zelda-esque design to both its graphics and gameplay, at least when compared to early Zelda titles. So, focusing much more on the action rather than the role-playing. Story-wise, you're a 4-year-old man with no memory of before, whatever that means. But having no memory does not mean having no purpose, and soon enough you'll learn that you'll to travel to distant island to slay dragons that took it over. But before you're anywhere near doing just that, there'll be a lot of typical for the genre adventuring and questing. So running around the game world, collecting and carrying items to their respective owners and killing baddies. Rinse and repeat. It may seem a tad simplistic, but that's what you get for trying to copy an 80s game in the 90s. The tech progressed and our machines were much more capable. Improving the graphics alone is just not enough. And this simple design also lends itself to Dragonstone's biggest issue. It's an uneven game. What I mean by that is while all the quests are incredibly easy, mainly following the take object from person A to person B, who will give you the item that person C needs to give you something instead, and that something is what person D requires. Like I said, a lot of walking but hardly a challenge. And in the same time, combat, at least in the first half, 2/3 of the game maybe, is very demanding. And the fact that the collision boxes are unclear doesn't make it any easier. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depends how you want to look at it, at some point the difficulty will top, and from then onward it will become easier and easier, making for the late game to be a breeze. So yeah, this also feels uneven. Graphics and sounds are phenomenal actually, and if the rest of the Dragonstone was of comparable quality, we would have had a hit on our hands. But painstakingly detailed and beautifully animated sprites cannot make up for the game's shortcomings. And what we ended up with is a very solid but sadly unexceptional old-style action RPG. Borobudur is a futuristic sci-fi mixed genre action-adventure. On the far-off planet Borobudur, evil Ragnova is constructing a terrible device that once completed is said to be capable of destroying all technology, and henceforth bringing the planet back to the Dark Ages. Since Batman's all the way back on Earth on my couch munching on something maniacally, you're our only hope of stopping him. I'm Batman! What? I see. Sure, I'll clear that up. Sorry. Apparently Bruce is not eating for the sake of eating alone or just to snack on something, but he's recovering after a particularly challenging encounter with a supervillain. He's been here last 2 weeks not moving an inch other than to go to the fridge or toilet, so I don't know what imaginary enemy he was battling. Unless it was his inner demons, then yeah, by all means, as he's got a ton of these. Anyway, that's more or less how Borobudur, the planet of doom, begins. Most of the game takes place in a side-scrolling platformer fashion, where you run around the levels seeking out and collecting number of hidden objects that are required to open the exit to the next stage. Simple stuff really. And as you go about it, you'll obviously have to defeat various enemies, gather power-ups and even do some very basic environmental puzzling. It's mainly Switch related, so don't expect to stretch that brain muscle of yours too much. You're not there on Borobudur to think after all, you're there to kill a lot. Then there are the quote-unquote driving/flying stages, where you pilot a spaceship in a third person behind the vehicle view. Same as in platforming levels, enemies will attack you constantly, and also same as in there, you'll have to bring their miserable lives to an abrupt and predictable end. Don't feel bad for them though, they're the bad guys. I mean, you're you, so by definition you're good, you're the protagonist of the game after all. Finally, there's a proper puzzling stage in which you need to move blocks over the board to recreate a specific pattern within the time limit. It's not overly challenging, but it's a nice change of pace and will finally give you a chance to shine in other ways than the body count. Borobudur may not be the best action game out there, in fact it's rather odd and unusual, but it's not a bad one, and it's more than worth a playthrough. Air Taxi, to simplify it, is a multiplayer AG in a different setting. Instead of prehistoric time, you operate in the future, and there can be up to 5 players playing simultaneously, causing absolute mayhem on the screen on a single Amiga, which you're sadly not going to see in this video, even if it's the most fun way of enjoying the game. Still, the basic premise prevails when you play alone and you have to pick up passengers from numbered platforms and then deliver them to those that they need to get to. They come in 3 classes, yellow, red and white. Unsurprisingly, a successful delivery of this rewards money, but if you crash, land too hard so that you're destroyed, or fail in any other way causing their demise, you'll have to pay for those deaths, quite literally out of your pocket. And early in the game it can be quite crippling. In the end, it's a great life lesson of slower, sometimes being actually faster. The further you progress in the levels, the more difficult and chaotic they'll be, adding various different obstacles to their design. This, naturally, will require mastering new gameplay concepts. So things like skyscrapers, magnetic fields, wind or even adjusted gravity in some spots will be your bread and butter among others, and you will have to get accustomed to all of them. They will keep you on your toes, but will also make the game more fun and chaotic in multiplayer. While AG is easily my favorite single-player version of the game because of that specific charm it emanates, charm that other games just don't have, Air Taxi is most likely the best version of the game to play with others. Or best I played, and easily a game to fill an afternoon. So if you have someone with you, get the game, fire it up and just get lost in an action-packed delivery bonanza. If you thought that the last episode's Forest Dump was it, and you'll never get to hear about the game again, I'm here to correct you. Because few years later, after the original, LK Avalon released Forest Dump Forever. Equally as dump game, but with a twist. Said twist being that the action has moved from the forest to a castle, and that the game was not a carbon copy of Super Frog anymore. At least not to the same, a way too obvious degree. Generally speaking, you're playing as the same protagonist and doing the exact same things you did in original, so collecting coins for the exit to open, all within the time limit. Same as last time too, the levels are rather large and always scrolling, full of various obstacles, deadly spikes and enemies. And identically to the predecessor, you dispose of the enemies by jumping on their heads, and spikes dispose of you by having you jump on them. And trust me, after a long session of Forest Dump Forever, you will be seeking those bad boys out just to throw yourself at them and end this terrible endeavor. But believe it or not, Forest Dump Forever is an obvious upgrade on the first game. Not graphically, as it stayed the same, so pretty decent, even if at times simple in terms of its animations. And definitely not in terms of sound design, which still has no in-game music and only a handful of sound effects. But in terms of the games that it copies. It's not Super Frog only anymore, and some design ideas clearly come from Rough and Tumble this time too. And don't get me wrong, both Super Frog and Rough and Tumble are excellent, far better than this monstrosity. But having some of their elements seemingly randomly put together in an entirely different game is as odd as it seems when you think about it. As below average generic platformers go, I've played worse. In fact, I've played much worse, and I'm sure you have too. But it doesn't mean that Forest Dump Forever is worth recommending. Especially that same as its predecessor, it's rather uninspired and boring. I mean, I wouldn't refuse playing it if it was running somewhere and someone would handle me a joystick telling me that it's my turn, but I also wouldn't ever run it on my own. Play it or don't, your call. I'm not gonna lie, I haven't played Hybrids before I started working on my older, by today's standards rather rough 10 years of Amiga gaming series. And it's a criminal overlooking on my side, as not only Hybrids is excellent, easily better than most Amiga vertically scrolling shoot 'em ups, but also a top 10, maybe even top 5 shooter on the system overall. And it came out in 1988. Way before Amiga peaked around 92-93. Let's start from the beginning though. Hybrids takes place in 2461, a good year, in equally as good future. But when things are too good for too long, something's bound to happen. This particular time, one of Earth's colonies on an alien planet Jurica has been destroyed, missing, hard to tell really, as any contacts with it ceased permanently. So, naturally, a task force is assembled and a scout ship is sent to figure out what took place and save any colonies if there are still any alive out there. The game is composed out of 3 levels only, desert, ocean and mountains themed, but there are huge and all incredibly well designed, sporting unique to each other features. Both your ship and the swarms of enemies coming at you at all times are painstakingly detailed to the last pixel and small works of art. It doesn't hurt that there's quite a few different ones too, keeping the gameplay fresh all the way through. Your craft can have 5 different upgrades mounted on it, and you should make sure to pick the right ones for your playstyle, to have as much fun as possible. As while different in how they work and their power, they are all feasible choices for the entire campaign. It's worth adding that the weapons can be mounted on your ship or split from it, flying around it as supplemental satellites of death. Satellites of death. I should really copyright it. Man, but make a note of that. Anyway, the choice of staying as one or splitting is a tough one, and should be best taken in response to the on-screen situation. You cannot make those switches infinitely, and there's only few times that you can do it, so don't overuse it too early. The bosses pop up both mid at the end of the levels and are usually much bigger and incomparably more challenging than the usual trash that you'll mowing through. They will require pattern memorization and ability to fight under immense pressure, so qualities that you quite fortunately have in abundance, my dear viewer. Graphics of Hybrids is what I'd like to call arcade quality, meaning that Hybrids wouldn't stick out negatively if it was put on a cabinet and kept in an arcade somewhere. In fact, in 1988 it would look great there any way you wanna look at it. Sounds and music are excellent too, especially all the explosions that are appropriately impactful sounding and meaty. It's great. All that said, Hybrids is not the easiest of shooters out there. It can get hectic at times and demands your full attention. But it's not fake tough though, meaning you won't experience any cheap deaths, and if you die, it'll be your mistake and yours only. Interestingly enough, when Hybrids released, there was a controversy surrounding its existence, as apparently it looked very similar to Danga UFO robo game from the arcades. It escalated so much that at some point it seemed that the copyright infringement claim seemed inevitable. But at least as far as I know, nothing was ever proven or done about it. And today is just a fun curiosity. Hybrids is amazing, and if you like shooters even just a little, definitely check it out. When it released at the tail end of 1994, Shadow Fighter was easily the best exclusive versus fighting game on the Amiga. Arguably better playing and running than Amiga's port of Street Fighter 2 and better looking than that of Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers. But when it came to original, system-unique titles, there was nothing that could compare to it. Body Blows games had graphics, and graphics alone, as the characters had very limited set of moves, and its gameplay was rather stiff, repeatable, unbalanced and not fun. Shadow Fighter is probably the best Street Fighter on the Amiga that's technically not a Street Fighter at all. It features 16 uniquely looking and very differently playing to each other characters and appropriate for them stages. Well, 17 if you count the training dummy, but I don't. 25 moves per fighter, up to 5 flashing explosive special attacks each, and even an optional blood, for those who prefer the Mortal Kombats to the Street Fighters. And I never saw how the game looked like without it on. So, Shadow Fighter is a game for all. Presentation-wise, it's all top tier. The sprites are large and smoothly animated, backgrounds are very different from one another too, chock full of detail and perhaps even more colorful than the characters are. Overall, it looks fantastic. Sounds and music are genre appropriate, well fitting to the on-screen action, but otherwise nothing out of ordinary. I mean, it's punches, jabs and kicks, so other than the occasional super special shout, they sound similar to those in other games. All that said, a very important question comes to mind. Is Shadow Fighter as good of a game as Street Fighter 2 in the arcades was? It's not. But it's damn close, and way better than any of the Body Blows games were on the Amiga. There's no comparison between these. One is a novel, fun and deep versus fighter, and another is Body Blows. Pole walki, which loosely translates to battlefield, is an obscure Polish, rather average turn-based strategy. While it's entirely in Polish and henceforth some gaming concepts may be slightly gated by the language barrier, if you give it a little time and some trial and error, you'll get the hang of it. Question is it worth the effort? Well, if you're a fan of the tactical turn-based strategy genre, then it may be. At the very least to learn all its mechanics, figure it all out and make your own mind about it. But if you're not, then you may just very well skip it and jump to our next game. Anyway, up to 4 players can battle it out in pole walki at once, be it player or CPU controlled, and everything takes place on a large scrolling top-down battlefield map. Each player starts with their own base and the same amount of funds to spend on one of the 6 types of mech units, and various equipment for them too. They all differ in stats of armor, firepower, shot range, capacity and current damage status, with the last one only being used while playing, as brand new, shiny and freshly purchased mechs are obviously undamaged. Each turn a player can buy equipment and issue orders to all units. This can be move, attack, repair, dig in for defense, or even request for air support. Naturally, defeating enemies and finding rich natural resource caches adds to your funds, so the better you do, the more you have to spend on your mechs. Pole walki is an interesting, even if unspectacular game. If you like strategies, especially those more methodical and tactical, then it may be worth tracking down and trying it out. But if you're not really into this, ignore it. There are better, more accessible and in English games out there. Screech is a top-down arcade racer not unlike the famous supercars. It features quite a few fun and often tricky tracks that will require you to give it your best, fast and action-packed racing, and most importantly 10 cars on the screen at once. Now, you may think that's unimpressive, cause 10 is actually not that much and we have games now that could easily display dozens of these in high-res and high detail, but back then, on the Amiga, in most top-down racers, 4 to 6 was a standard, with that lower number being the more common one. Additionally, having all 10 at once meant that they were smaller and by extension of that the tracks were more zoomed out, so much bigger chunks of them were clearly visible at once. So, fast racing, while not easy per se, was in fact a bit easier than in other titles, where in most cases the viewpoint was heavily zoomed in. Many of the tracks feature shortcuts, which can make or break your race. And while there's no weapons in Screech to speak of, it doesn't mean that it's blunt or boring. No, there are water and oil spills everywhere, seemingly randomized but often feeling like in the worst possible spot, and from time to time a pedestrian will, for whatever the reasons, show up on the track and when driven over will leave oddly satisfying bloody tracks. Screech may not be as big, feature-rich and well-known as Supercars was, but it's an excellent fun little racer nonetheless, that 2 of you can have fun in on a single Amiga. Its presentation is quite good too. Graphics are nice and colorful, and while the sprites are rather small, for cars, pedestrians and most roadside objects they are nicely detailed and clearly a lot of attention was given to them. Sounds are okay, and that's as much as I can say about them. They're there and they fit. Screech is perhaps one of the many overhead racers on the Amiga, but despite being rather unknown, it's a good one, and well worth your time. Extreme racing is what Mario Kart on the Amiga would be if it ever released without licensing Nintendo's famous characters. It offers 8 different racers to choose from, each uniquely looking and with its own vehicle and playstyle. Up to 4 players can play on a single system, or 8 when 2 systems are connected via null modem or an RS-232 cables. Sounds like a bit troublesome approach, but I suppose that if you manage to gather 8 eager gamers in one room back then, it had to be hella fun. There are 3 gameplay modes in single player: a cup, where you compete for points in one of 4 cups, each consisting of 5 tracks, the tournament mode, in which apart from trying to be the first, you also race for money that can be used to purchase upgrades for the forthcoming races. And finally, the time trial, which kinda explains itself quite well. What's worth noting about it, however, is that it's a pure time attack mode where there are no opponents to compete against whatsoever. In multiplayer, a definitely most entertaining way to play the game, there are 4 modes overall. First 2 are the same as in single player, so cup and tournament, and the latter 2 being versus, in which you race head-to-head on a chosen track, and battle mode, which is a mixture of Nintendo's Super Mario Kart and Street Racers gameplay. Interestingly enough, released in 1996 Upgrade Pack not only included bug fixes and new tracks, but also additional 2 cups for a total of 6, and most importantly, a level editor, using which, I must add, some hardcore fans release tracks even today. Graphics-wise, the game is as good as your system can handle, so on a basic A1200 it won't look great with chunky pixels and small gameplay window, but on 060 CPU or via emulation it can be quite pretty. It won't run on basic small OCS ECS Amigas at all, however. So, is Extreme Racing as good as Super Mario Kart? No, it's not, but it's best kart racer Amiga had, and a pretty good one at that. Pinball Brain Damage is one of the best looking pinball games on the Amiga, especially that it works in high-res mode natively and can be even switched into a super high-res so that you could see the whole table on screen at once without scrolling, if your system and screen can handle it, that is. And since we're on the subject, there are only 2 tables available in the game. Hyper Evolution, a car steam table in which you first have to get your driver's license, then tune your car up, and finally race around and run away from the police. The second is Magnetic Whirlpool, B-movies-inspired table, full of monsters and such, and overusing the ramps and tunnels to an ungodly degree in my opinion. The top side of the screen feels as if the designers ran out of ideas and their solution was to chuck as many of these there as they could fit, and then add few extra more on top. It looks bad and it's confusing mess. I have no idea what to aim there for, what to score on, it's odd. Pinball Brain Damage's ball physics are really good, however, probably the best on the Amiga. Now, while they're excellent and no doubt important part of any pinball game, they do not make or break it alone. So comparably speaking, Pinball Fantasy's physics were nowhere near as good, and yet it was a much better game. With fun, easy to understand and learn tables, plenty of scoring opportunities, and excellent presentation, graphics and soundware. Oh, and same as in virtually any other pinball game in existence, it could be played in multiplayer. Pinball Brain Damage is single player only. Weird design choice, but whatever. Fortunately, pinball games can be easily played alternating, so it is what it is. All in all, Pinball Brain Damage is a fun, even if tad flawed game. Personally, I find its 2 tables only fun limiting factor, especially that realistically speaking, I'll only be playing on one of them anyway, so a much wider selection would do it good. But if you're a fan of the genre or like to occasionally play around with flippers, it's an excellent addition to any Amiga owner's collection. Sierra Soccer World Challenge Edition, interesting title as there was no other version of the game, short of a Gaming Mag cover disc demo, is my most favorite football game on the Amiga, for a variety of reasons that I will list chaotically over the next minute or so. It's difficult enough to pose a challenge, but in the same time accessible and easy to control so that strategy, management and role-playing centered geeks like myself will not feel lost and powerless playing it, like we kinda do in Sensible Soccer. Or is it just me? Anyway, Sierra Soccer uses an early but rather good 3D engine, and while it's not very sophisticated, it's very simple for the end user to understand and grasp control of, and allows for taking of all those free kicks and penalties to be a pure pleasure, as you feel that you have complete control over where the ball will be going, more or less. And yeah, seasoned kickoff or sensible soccer players can probably aim the ball in the respective titles with pinpoint accuracy, but as I mentioned initially, I am and always was mainly a strategy and role-playing gamer, so those high-octane arcadey football games were beyond means of reasonable control for me. They're too fast, too technical, too difficult is what I'm trying to say here. Sierra Soccer skill-wise landed somewhere in between my beloved Football Managers and arcade games, and that was, it seems, a sweet spot for me. So, I could comfortably play it without constantly feeling like an underdog, and yet never feel as if there was no challenge ahead of me. In the end, all you need to know that it's a very unique football game that runs great, looks decent, and even complete footy noobs like myself can enjoy it. It's not as widely spread or well known as the other footballing behemoths on the Amiga, but just as fun. Rough and Tumble starring Rough Rogers, a hero I've never heard of before, or for that matter one I've never heard of after either, well, until few years ago at least, when he resurfaced again in a new game, this time rebranded as Rad Rogers, but other than that, identically looking. Anyway, Rough and Tumble is an Amiga exclusive run-and-gun console quality action shooter. Sure, it's not really left-to-right fair as most other games in the genre are, and allows for a free all-way movement and scrolling. But other than that, all the defining characteristics of the genre are kept and present within it, namely the running and the gunning. Yeah, story behind the game is pretty standard for the genre and centers around you playing as Raph, who lost his marbles after going through a mystical portal leading to evil Dr. Destiny's alien planet. And I meant losing your marbles in the most literal sense of the word. They were really colorful marbles, and you really just lost them. Now, from that point onward, you set on a 16-level strong adventure to find all of them and defeat evil Dr. Steamhead robots. In each of the stages, all you have to do is to find and collect all RGB-colored marbles and keys. And this literally translates to kill everything that moves and pick up everything you can. When you grab a particular required number of marbles, a door to the next stage will open and you'll be able to progress. Sounds simple, right? Well, it's anything but. Cause other than the first couple of levels or so, Rough and Tumble gets unforgiving really fast, throwing seemingly countless numbers of enemies at you from all sides all the time. Fortunately, you're not defenseless, and while your initial gun is rather weak, there are numerous upgrades scattered around the levels, and these new weapons are considerably more deadly and useful. Even armed with them, however, Rough and Tumble is an extremely demanding game, and to be successful in it, you need to take a bit different approach to it than the genre name suggests. So, while you will still stick to gunning, pew-pewing at enemies at all times, running is not the best idea. So slow down, cause in Rough and Tumble, slower is actually much faster. But if you're a master gamer, hackerman, or however else the true joystick assassins call themselves these days, then yeah, by all means go ahead and run and gun. As you can see, presentation is definitely Rough and Tumble's strongest suit. It's incredible. It looks like a game that should be running on SNES or Sega Genesis and not on the Amiga. And yet, it does. And only on the Amiga. And all that because...
Only Amiga makes it possible.
F-17 Challenge is an interesting arcade racer. It's interesting because it's a touch away from being great and just falls short of reaching that mark because of some small but overall quite significant issues. But we'll get back to it in a minute. The game is Team 17's first attempt at the racing genre and features very nice and fluidly animated graphics, chock full of little touches like rain or sparks flying off the cars when they collide, pretty decent sprite scaling and quite good car models. For the time and system, that is. Even though there's whopping 22 cars racing at the same time, F-17 telegraphs the feeling of speed perfectly, and I don't have to tell you that it's hella important in any and all racers. The sounds are okay, but nothing that would have lifted it above the generic racer average. There are two gameplay modes to choose from in F-17, Arcade and Normal. In first, you have to finish in the top 3 each time to progress further, whereas in Normal you accumulate racing points appropriate to the position that you ended up on after each race is completed. While all the tracks are seemingly recreations of real-life circuits, to me all they seem identical and it's very difficult to tell one from another unless you've played the game for hours. That said, the biggest issue with F-17 are the opposing cars. They seem to be doing nothing else than trying to get in your way, like literally they constantly try to block you, and that's not a great game design. Because while I understand that it happens in real-life races, it's not all that the drivers are doing. Some actually try to win them, you know? In real life, it would be extremely risky and life-threatening behavior and an unlikely occurrence. In F-17, it happens all the freaking time. I'm not saying that it makes the game much more difficult, but it makes it needlessly annoying. Despite all I said, I actually like F-17. I do, but only for a race or two every now and then. Metal Combat, despite what the title and how it's written may suggest, has as much to do with Mortal Kombat as hot dogs have with fine dining. Sure, you'll munch on one, dripping with mustard and ketchup every once in a while when in a rush and while watching a sporting event, but you're not gonna take a girl on a hot dog date, right? Unless you will, then kudos to you, sir, for not giving any shits whatsoever. You're probably the coolest hot potato that has ever walked the earth. Anyway, Metal Combat is more similar to Final Fight than Mortal Kombat, so it's a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Though scrolling is a very strong word when talking about this game, and comparing it to even Amiga's weak port of Final Fight is borderline criminal too. But what is Metal Combat then? Well, in grim post-apocalyptic future, in a Terminator-like scenario where all human life is long gone, only machines survived. And them being originally made by us, they've inherited some of our traits, namely aggression, hate and prejudice. So you know, A+ stuff. And since there's only 2 factions of machines left, they fight for control of whatever scraps are left of the dead Earth. They are based on Amigas and early 90s PCs, and these computers are the computing powers behind running the machines. Cool, right? It is, but sadly the gameplay is not there to support the idea. You can pick one of 6 available robots, that vary very little in how they fight and control, and you have to take them through 14 boring-ass levels. It's not great. Being able to play Metal Combat with a friend, however, subjecting them to the same cringe and bad gameplay experience seems to be the only nearly redeeming thing going for the game. Cause why suffer alone when misery loves the company? Metal Combat is a pretty bad game and it's hardly worth your time, but it's rare and an exclusive, so even if for science only, you should really play it at least once. World Cup Soccer is a follow-up to earlier Brutal Sports Football and a second game in the Brutal Sports series. It's futuristically overly glorified interpretation of soccer that released alongside real-life 1994's World Cup, no doubt to cash in on the adjacency to the event. And same as in the early game, it's not all about scoring, it's mainly about violence. So while you technically in theory could win the game by scoring more goals, in reality you can win even when theoretically losing 10-1 score-wise. All by killing/disabling all of the opposing team's players. So fouls, as you've known them in regular-ass football, or soccer for you folks on the other side of the pond, are not a game-stopping event in World Cup Soccer. They're a feature, and one that's worth exploiting and quite a lot of dough on top of that. So while you can tackle in any way you please, you can also punch, kick, stab or even behead your opponents. That last move in particular is worth a nifty 200k at the end of the match, and money that then can be spent on new better players, extra opens and such between games. Mortars, swords, shields, all that's in the game, and that's just scratching the surface when it comes to armament, as like I said initially, it's more about who wins and not about who scores more here. World Cup Soccer is viewed from an isometric top-down perspective and it takes a little getting used to. So do the controls, but when you master them both, defeating CPU and getting on top of the league and the titular World Cup should be pretty easy. And that's why it's a game to play with a friend only. Cause not only it's more fun then, but a person can actually provide a challenge. Also, if you play together, you're both affected by a rather limited and choppy frame rate and scrolling. They're annoying beyond belief, but if you're both a victim, you can get used to it, right? World Cup Soccer with a friend is definitely a title to play a game or two once every full moon. Against CPU, however, I would only recommend it to the most hardcore fans of the odd sporting games. Dunwalder is an obscure Polish isometric view action adventure title, not unlike more well-known Cadaver or Heimdall. The game takes place on Mars in 2998 within the confines of the Martian space base. The transporter D-86 with which you were traveling was attacked, and you were betrayed by your now former colleagues, Mary, James and Al. The game revolves around you trying to find them to seek justice. So, to unleash your inner demons of rage and enact the sweetest and deadliest of revenges upon them. The base that you're trapped in is composed out of 5 sub-areas of communication center, laboratory, prison, mine and nondescript side building. And these are full of various enemies, human and cyborg alike, which for whatever the reason are all bent on killing you. But other than the combat, you also do quite a lot of your typical adventuring, so you'll be solving simple puzzles, finding and talking to NPCs, and also performing tasks for them in exchange for useful items or information. Graphically, Dunwalder is actually pretty good, definitely above average for 1994 when it came to Polish games, and the sound design is decent too. Sadly, however, it only ever came out in its original language, and since it leans heavily on the adventuring, its eventual popularity was rather limited. Overall, it feels like a fun, even if unpolished Polish title. Wow, this time this terrible pun was not intended. And it's a game worth checking out if you know the language. If you don't, treat it as a curiosity to listen about in this video and then forget forever. Commodore officially ceased to exist in the first half of 1990s. It was a sad time and most of us, hardcore Amiga fanboys and fangirls, long believed that someone will buy their assets and resurrect the system, so that it could come back stronger, better, faster, leaner and cooler than ever before. As we know now, it never happened. But it also never stopped enthusiasts from releasing games for the system years after it was long declared gone. Bubble Heroes, released in 2000, is one of those games. Simply put, it's a bust-a-move clone, but arguably at the very least as good, if not better than the original was. The idea behind the gameplay is incredibly simple. You complete increasingly more demanding puzzle levels by shooting color bubbles from the bottom of the screen at the top, where there are more of these arranged in various patterns. If the one that you shot touches others of the same color, and there's at least 3 of them in one chain, they pop and disappear. You know, like bubbles do. There are 3 different characters to choose from: Brave Knight, Cat Girl and Prince turned into a frog, and all of them have their own unique special powers helpful during gameplay. There are also 3 game modes to tackle in Bubble Heroes: Story Mode, in which your completion of levels follows the game's plot and sets you on a course to planet Radia to free 3 nymphs from Evil Gonzol's grasp, a villain of the game so to speak. Then there is Championship Mode, in which you duel against all characters from the game as AI opponents. And finally, Deathmatch, where you and a friend, or an enemy, can battle it out against each other in split-screen side-by-side action. Despite being released so late in the Amiga's life, or long after it really, Bubble Heroes is amazing, and if you have it in your collection, it's a gem to behold, and will guarantee countless hours of fun with friends. Believe it or not, but with another Polish game in the video. This time it's terrible though. And yeah, I really mean it. It's a first-person shooter that just failed at everything it could fail at. For starters, rather than the series of levels following a particular plot and offering a sensation of some kind of progression upon completion, you're served 20 generic-looking arenas filled with numerous enemies. There's no puzzles, no secrets, nothing interesting in them really, and you're not even looking for the exit. All you do is kill the monsters. And when you kill them all, you are moved to the next arena. Rinse and repeat. There are 20 of these boring-ass levels in Monster and they never really get better. So you go through them one after another expecting, nay, hoping for something new and captivating, and in the end all you really get is repetitive mess, uninteresting enemies, awful level design and disappointing presentation. Graphics are beyond terrible. Not only they look bland but are also illogically put together, like featuring trees that grow straight out of concrete brick pavement for instance. And sadly, that's not all. There are no ceilings of any kind in any of the stages, and everything other than the monsters is in various shades of brown. Sounds and music are below average too. Worst of all, the pacing is shit. I mean, first 15 levels are very easy, a tutorial like difficulty easy, but the last 5, oh my days! It's like someone suddenly realized what they've done in the first bunch, and instead of fixing them, just turned the dial all the way up for the last few. Monster is bad. Don't play it. Unless you're an FPS aficionado and just have to sample them all. Then yeah, you can risk it. Blob is a quintessential Amiga exclusive. It's a faux 3D puzzle platformer that is rather difficult but not artificially so. So you never feel as if you were cheated out of your life when you lose it. And all failures and deaths are yours, and yours alone. The game is viewed from bird's eye perspective and you're placed on a platform with similar ones on the same level, below and above you, and you can move freely between them. The gameplay revolves around you completing a particular objective and then finding the exit, pretty much every single time. Set objectives, however, are really varied and there's a whole slew of them. Some will see you having to either paint a certain number of blocks Q*bert style, or rescue other blobs and bring them to the exit, and others will have you finding a particular required object. And that all is just the tip of an iceberg that the game is. Because there's more. Some platforms that you jump on are special and may crack after a jump or two, others are sticky, severely limiting your jumping capabilities, some reveal invisible blocks and some even shoot at you. And that's just a small subset of them all. All that put together, with a rather nice even if unspectacular presentation, make Blob one of the most addicting experiences of 1993 on the Amiga. It may not look like it on the footage, but there's just that one more time feeling to it that sees you coming back to Blob time after time again, even if you keep failing at it. It's a definite recommendation. Vital Light is easily one of the best puzzle games to ever grace the Amiga, and same as Tetris, it draws its addictive characteristic from very basic but also incredibly challenging hectic gameplay mechanics. So, its entry threshold is very low, as it will take you just a minute to understand the game and everything about it, but mastering Vital Light, especially that it contains 80 increasingly more demanding levels, will take a lot of time and many repeated stages. I can pretty much guarantee it. So, you control a paint gun on a roller at the bottom of the screen and you have 5 different paints attached to it at all times. Your task, technically speaking, is beyond simplistic, and all you have to do is paint sets of blocks falling at various speeds from above in the same color. When you do, they are removed from the screen. That's it. Nothing more to it, really. So, the strategy is mainly based in twofold, making sure to switch to the right paint color fast enough and to apply it to the correct strip of blocks, as more often than not there will be numerous of these falling down at the same time. Like most great puzzle games, Vital Light is incredibly simple to understand, but in the same time very challenging to beat, and many of the latter levels will feel devilishly hard, to the point of one seemingly random small mistake being enough to break your entire game. So be fast, but also be precise. The presentation in terms of graphics and sound design is excellent, and it's not something that we see often in the genre, so it was worth pointing out. If you like those fast-paced puzzle games, make sure to check Vital Light out, as it's a true hidden gem in Amiga's vast library of exclusives. Blue Boy is not a great game. In fact, it's rather bad. Fortunately, most other games in the video are better. Anyway, despite not wooing anyone with anything really, Blue Boy is an interesting and unusual title, as it's a sort of mix between tower defense and missile command with a very direct control scheme. You play as the teacher of Blue Boy, a 5 cents worth superhero, a sidekick without a true hero to follow, a budget Superboy, cause Superman is way too good to be compared to him, a wannabe without skills and powers to follow through. But what you don't lack is the will. And despite your shortcomings, you do your best and you're trying to save humans from aliens who are abducting them at an alarming rate. No doubt to perform those forbidden backside probing we keep hearing about in the pop culture. So, you fly around the levels, disposing of the alien scum and saving humans. There's a defender-like radar on the screen showing you where humans and aliens are at all times, so that you can stay on top of things and plan your routes most effectively. If an alien manages to capture a human, you have to promptly get to them, eliminate said alien and save the person, basking in the glory of your heroics. Keep in mind that to progress and carry on through the game, both are required, keeping yourself and at least some of the humans alive. Freed humans can be released from the cocoons aliens entangled them in order to obtain various boons, like extra weapons, smart bombs or additional lives. So be smart, be fast, be effective, be the superhero. When all aliens are eradicated and there are still some humans left alive on the level, the wave is considered complete. For every city that you defend, there are 2 waves, and then the boss fight with an alien mothership. Just as I stated initially, Blue Boy is not great, but if you wanna try something literally unlike anything else, it's definitely one to keep an eye on. Black Viper is my boss's wife, cause her soul is dark and she's a vile venomous creature and not a human. Also a great name for a Batman's villain. I'm Batman! Sure. But it's not the same. I meant other... okay. So, Bruce asked me to tell you that he has his poison ivy and it's basically the same thing. He didn't really care to hear me out when I tried explaining that it was just an intro, but whatever. Black Viper, the game, takes place in the post-nuclear war dystopian future and is a late Amiga motorcycle-based racer/shooter. Also, so that we get it out of the way, not a very good game. Not terrible, just not great. You play as one of the so-called freedom fighters who travels from city to city trying to recapture them from the hands of the mercenaries. To do so, you have to get to them on open roads with an allotted time limit. It would be pretty easy if that was all, so naturally you are constantly attacked by numerous enemy vehicles, slowing you down. You know, post-apo Mad Max style. Fortunately, you can shoot them all, so that's what you'll do most of the time. Each next level is more demanding than the last, throwing more resistant enemies at you, but in between the stages you can upgrade your bike too. So if you keep doing it, the difficulty curve should stay more or less the same throughout your entire playthrough. So, Black Viper sounds cool and should be fun, right? But somehow it isn't. It's hard to say why, it just feels lacking. I mean, just check it out yourself and let me know if you agree. I'm sure that you will. Enemy Tempest of Violence is a 34-level strong side-view action-adventure game for 1 or 2 players. Each level is composed of a series of single screens with no scrolling and presents you with a set of unique objectives to fulfill before the time runs out. And they can be rescuing survivors, destroying alien eggs, finding weapons, or killing certain specific aliens, to name a few. They are randomized though, so each playthrough will mix and assign them to different levels, keeping the gameplay fresh for a tad longer. While you go after your objectives, enemies in the form of various alien species will try to stop you, so naturally you have to dispose of them, once and for all, preferably as fast as you can. Mechanically speaking, even despite very limited one-button controls, there's quite a lot that you can actually do in the game. You can obviously run and gun, slide, jump up, far and down, switch weapons, crouch, arm and throw grenades, pick up ammo, weapons and other items, operate various devices, enter passages, and even issue instructions to other characters if in-game situation allows for that. You could say that Tempest of Violence is your Flashback 2.0. The most prominent feature of the game, however, are easily its lush and beautifully animated graphics. There are shadows to basically all characters in the first plane, bullet casings fly around, dead aliens lie rotting away everywhere, and there are numerous easily recognizable weapons and items for pickup. Enemy Tempest of Violence wins in both categories, looks and playability. And only the fact that it released in 1997, long after Amiga was officially dead, prevented it from being widely successful. As if it dropped in, let's say, 1992, 1993, I could see it move some serious numbers and be quite profitable for the devs and publishers. Before Team 17's Worms, we had Scorched Tanks. And while Scorched Tanks may not look as good or be as accessible, it's an amazing deep mechanically title and one I probably spent much more time playing than Worms while I still had an Amiga, simply because it came out earlier. Now, as I said all that, I see that it's a bit misleading and a lie, as I have an Amiga even today. But I meant at the time when it was still an officially supported prospering platform, and not an old yellowed retro machine connected to artificially keeping it alive life support system in the form of few of us still remembering it that it is today. Anyway, Scorched Tanks is really well designed and a blast to play, especially with up to 3 friends on a single system. The levels are randomly generated and composed of mainly hills and valleys made out of destructible terrain. There is a selection of easily over 70 different weapons to choose from and dozens of different kinds of shields. Weapons can range from simple explosives of various power through homing and under-the-earth surface tracing ones to even scattering bombs or nukes. And there are also special ones that can either provide protective walls for you or bury your opponent under a huge pile of dirt, effectively changing their whole strategy for the next turn, as attacking possibilities from under the surface are rather limited. Shields are quite ingenious too, because they're not only lowering the damage sustained, but can offer additional special features, like bouncing off of incoming enemy projectiles from their surface, or magnetically repelling metal shots directed your way, among many others. Scorched Tanks is a game that would never win any awards for graphics or sounds, as these were serviceable at best, despite even displaying 64 colors on 1 MB chip machines, but in terms of gameplay alone, it's one of the most memorable experiences on the Amiga. By now, if you've been watching these videos of mine for a while, you should know that Amiga gamers were very hungry for good FPS titles in the mid-90s. And despite platform being seemingly incapable of handling these, developers proved that if there's a will, there's a way, and we ended up with bucketfuls of games. Sadly, most were disappointing for one reason or another, but at least there were plenty enough of them for players to be able to find one that they would enjoy. From a technical point of view, Project Battlefield was interesting as it could run on any Amiga provided it had at least 1 MB of RAM. Now, was it smart attempting to tackle it on such a platform? Not really, but you could, and in 1995, for a remainder of all Amiga gamers, it was kinda important. In Project Battlefield you play as Robocop wannabe, though arguably a better version of the original as you're not rid of your memories, I think. And you will have to track down and overpower improbable in real life numbers of terrorists and their robotic military servants, over 5 pretty big stages depicted as overrun by them government buildings. While all the staples of the genre are present in the game, so exploration, gunfights against countless enemies, teleports, keycards and hidden passages, as soon as you start playing on anything other than the rather powerful system, the shortcomings of Project Battlefield's engine will become more than obvious. Not only the game is displayed in a stump-sized window, but also runs like crap, and having expanded system is a must for any kind of comfortable play. What's worse, the requirements seem to have no basis in the presentation, as it's seriously disappointing when compared to other titles in the genre we've covered on this channel today. I mean, if you look at Alien Breed 3D or Breathless, Project Battlefield looks extremely dated. Not to mention the Citadel or Groom Deluxe, which both run much better than it does. But, since the game's Polish, a Polish proverb will apply nicely to the climate the game released in when all of us wanted to play Doom on our Amigas and couldn't. If you don't have what you like what you have. Sure, logically it's incorrect, but proverbs are not based in logic, and by 1995 the remaining Amiga gamers would do pretty much anything to emulate the FPS experience, and henceforth the games like this one were not only still made, but also still played. Walker is a side-scrolling arcade shooter where you control a huge mech, plowing through hundreds upon hundreds of minuscule enemy soldiers and vehicles, exactly like mechs tend to do. Unusually to all other scrolling shooters, however, you move left and not right, which is odd but not something you won't get used to in 5 minutes. Walker is built out of 4 levels, each ending with an epic boss fight and each differently themed. First is set in 1944 Berlin, second in 2019 LA, third in a very generalized and stereotypical Middle East, and last in the year 2420 during the so-called The Great War. Not to mistake with 1914's The Great War. To defeat the enemies you have unlimited use machine guns and limited rockets. The guns overheat after constant use, however, so you have to manage a series of shots and not just hold the trigger pressed at all times. Well, the proverbial trigger, as you'll be clicking a mouse really. Either way, you have to pick and choose your targets well, as the enemies will be coming at you from all sides, so going for the most dangerous ones is a must if you aim to survive, and possibly even complete the game. Naturally, if or when your mech is destroyed, you lose a life, and when all 3 are lost, the game ends. Graphically and sound-wise, especially if you have 2 MB of RAM, the game is pretty nice and sounds great. Something that we've grown used to in DMA Designs games. the very same DMA that years later became Rockstar. The gameplay is rather solid too, pitting you against thousands of tiny soldiers armed with various guns and machinery, making you feel like a badass unstoppable invader. So nothing to complain about in the fun department either. Apart from getting a bit repetitive more or less 2 levels in, that is. But destroying those small couple of pixel style enemies is very enjoyable, so it's not something that would discourage from completing this otherwise pretty short title. While Walker was designed for one player where joystick is used to control the mech and mouse to shoot, it can actually be played in co-op multiplayer, where each person controls one of the 2 inputs. It may sound odd, but it's surprisingly fun, especially when drinks are involved. The Sperry's Legacy is a top-down action adventure role-playing, and when it came out it looked and played a lot like Zelda on SNES does, for the first 30 minutes or so at least. Cause upon closer inspection, other than the presentation and gameplay mechanics, it was nowhere near as good as the original was. It's not terrible, mind you, just not as good as everyone was hoping that it would be. Especially in 1996, when Amiga was already commercially dead and the remaining user base craved something new and epic. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What is it all about? Well, there is a kingdom, and it's ruled by a wise and just king. The king had 2 sons, and as in most fairy tales, or games for that matter too, one was good and the other was evil. And the evil one killed the good. Now, seeing what became of his only son, the king disowned him and asked you, the protagonist, named Cho by the way, 1 O away from being Chu, like a Chu. Anyway, he asked you to get rid of his evil son in exchange for the throne. If that sounds stupid, then it's good, cause that's precisely how it is. Stupid. Aside from being a pretty sweet deal for the Cho, that is. Zelda was a very simplified RPG, to the very core of the genre in fact, but it more than made up for it with gripping story and addictive gameplay full of secrets and little adventures to be had. The Sperry's Legacy is as simple, if not simpler even, and does not even try to make things right. It just assumes that the similar enough concept, presentation and mechanics will make it a must-have and ends up being an odd game, where you can theoretically do the same things you could in the classic, so walk, look at things, talk to characters and fight, but instead of becoming a legendary title, it became a caricature of the original only. On the plus side though, the enemies are quite varied and interestingly designed, but given how some of them can only be defeated by certain weapons and others are near impossible to keep an aim on, the combat system generally speaking is quite uneven. The game world is pretty huge, way bigger than I ever expected it to be, but also quite empty, meaning that there's not much there to do other than the plot pushing stuff. So more often than not, you'll find yourself wandering around the map looking for something, anything to do, which is not a great game design. Sperry's graphics are pretty nice, even if nothing to write home about, and the sounds are decent. Music, however, gets old fast and there's no way of turning it off, which is tad annoying. Now, I seem to be dumping on the Sperry's Legacy as if it was a monstrosity on a Pro Soccer 2190 scale, but no, it's not. In fact, it's okay. It really is, and I'm only complaining because it had a huge potential. The building blocks are there, it just failed to deliver on all of them, and ended up being average at best. Super Taekwondo Master is a sequel to year prior's Taekwondo Master, and also an obscure Polish versus fighting game in vein of Mortal Kombat, meaning that it uses digitized graphics for its fighters, but despite being released few years after the classic, its presentation is subpar at best, and terrible at worst. The fighters themselves are decently made, solid 4, maybe 4.5 out of 10, but there's barely 6 of them and they have 4 special moves each only. Yes, 4. And if these were fun, explosive, imaginative or even combo opening attacks, it would be all fine. No, really, it would, as the game would become a bit more technical than most other fighters on the market were. But they're not. They're as sad and disappointing as the rest of it is. The backgrounds, while scrolling unlike in original Taekwondo Master, are a jumbled mess. I mean, they look if someone was given access to Microsoft Paint, or Deluxe Paint in case of the Amiga, and 15 minutes each to create them, having no intimate knowledge of how the software works at all. So they're full of heavily contrasting and not well fitting together colors and objects of questionable genesis. Some of them straight up look as if the artist was just trying out different brushes on them, and then after doing so decided not to clear them off and leave them as they were. There are a few gameplay modes included, but they're your typical fare for the genre of single player versus and tournament like modes, so not much to talk about really. And even in 2-player versus with a buddy, Super Taekwondo Master is only ever fun for a few minutes. Oh, and for whatever the reason, the game speed is tied to the speed of your system, so if you played via emulation or on an upgraded Amiga, it may actually run way too fast to be even playable. Keep that in mind. Carcharodon White Sharks is one of the most beautiful games on the Amiga, and a pretty decent while not outstanding at anything that it does, horizontally scrolling shoot 'em up. While aforementioned graphics can be stunning, especially some of the backgrounds, enemy sprites and some of the bosses being the obvious examples of that, the gameplay is rather bland. It's basically legions of enemies coming at you from all sides, and they move so fast that you hardly ever get a chance to stop pressing the fire button for your finger to recover. I'm not sophisticated when it comes to my shooters, and I like them simple, other than the deluxe Galaga / Warblade that is. So this is not a big issue for me. But if you expect novelty, complicated boss tactics and memorization of enemy attack and approach patterns, there are far better games than this one on the Amiga. What's most notable about Carcharodon though is its unique weapon system, which allows for combining them together, and given the choices in the game, there's literally close to 37 million different possible combinations. And I'm not shitting you, that's the number. Sure, while that's obviously a lot, it doesn't really feel like it, so don't let the number fool you into thinking that the game is something else, something more than it is. The number is heavily inflated and most of the possible combinations will hardly feel any different. And what Carcharodon really is just a competent playing and awesome looking shooter, nothing more, nothing less. If you're a fan of a genre, you've played better, believe me, but definitely don't skip this one either. If you're not, give it a go, I think it's worth at least a try. While still beautiful and technically impressive, Shadow of the Beast 3 does not leave you awed and as impressed as previous titles did. But just because it's not as immediately stunning doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, it's the best playing out of all three. And honestly, in terms of pure gameplay at least, there's no competition really. Beast games seem to follow a very odd formula of the better it looks, the worse it plays. And this, third one, is definitely least flashy of them all. But one I can actually enjoy and get behind. With first two only ever serving as Amiga capabilities show-offs, at least that's how I used them, that is. So, Shadow of the Beast 3 being an action puzzle platformer is utterly enjoyable and the first game in the series that actually feels as if it was designed to be played and not only looked at. And as that, it features considerably smaller areas, more contained, better designed and with severely limited randomness in its enemies spawning and attacking mechanics, making it considerably more predictable, less frantic and as a result, tons more fun. Beast 3 starts off when the second ended. You're finally human and you must once again face Melomonster, the Beast Lord, in order to break his curse and be able to come back home. To defeat him though, you must gain enough power to stand a chance, and you will by collecting 4 mythical artifacts. Each of them hidden in a different level, so same as in most other platformers, progress in Beast is very linear. The game is full of various environmental puzzles, mainly focusing on finding and operating various thematically fitting apparatus and opening doors and passages. While this third outing may not be the best presentation-wise out of all three, it is still the very top tier of what Amiga could offer and looks and sounds phenomenal. The music especially is fantastic. So, if you saw first and second game on any other system and would like to learn how the story concluded, Amiga is the only machine you'll be able to do so on. Megaball is a public domain game, meaning it was distributed freely in a reduced format with less levels included and no level editor. Registering and paying for a full version, however, unlocks all these missing features. It's kinda similar but not identical to shareware that we know from PC. It is also bar none the best version of Arkanoid or Breakout on the system. And with all the levels available, extra paddle upgrades and included built-in level editor, it easily offers hundreds upon hundreds of hours of fun. If you've never played either of the classics, then first of all, I don't believe you, and second, let me explain. Megaball is a single-screen arcade title in which there are colorful bricks on top of the screen arranged in various patterns and you control the paddle sliding on the bottom. And that paddle's used to bounce the ball at the bricks to destroy them. When destroyed, they drop upgrades from time to time, which can range from simple paddle size enlargement through ability to hold the ball, to mounting the paddle with cannons that can shoot powerful projectiles destroying everything in their way, and all that is barely just scratching the surface. The level is considered completed when all bricks are cleared, and you lose life when the ball is not bounced and falls through the bottom of the screen. It's a simple but addictive mechanic that we saw in hundreds of other games, but Megaball perfected the formula. I don't think that there are many games in the genre even today that could compare with Megaball's ingenuity. Perhaps early 2000s DX Ball on PC could, but if that's even the case, it would still leave Megaball as one of the 2 best Arkanoid clones ever made. If you like those kinds of games, Megaball is one that you should not skip. Would an 8-bit kind of a design game work in 16-bit games clothing? Well, we've seen dozens on this channel that tried and failed. often terribly, either not looking or sounding up to par, or even worse, playing like a memory you long wanted forgotten. Naughty Ones is a flick-screen arcade platformer with some very superficial puzzling and a lot of pixel-perfect platforming. The idea behind it is that simple. In essence, all you have to do is find the key, which will automatically open the passage to the next level, and then go through that passage. Rinse and repeat. Nothing less, nothing more. And while that sounds simple, no doubt about that, the levels are filled with the enemies and dozens of timing-based environmental hazards. So, these enemies naturally have to be shot or avoided, though given the game's design and need to often take the same route more than once, shooting is nearly always a better choice. Various upgrades can be found and picked up while playing, but they're usually placed in difficult to get to locations, so it's often a gamble between either risking a life and trying to get them or playing it safe and just chasing the keys. Your call. Defeated enemies drop coins which offer points rewards, and since it's an 8-bit game at its heart, you play for points. And fun, but mainly points. Naughty Ones do not place any time limits on how long you've got to beat the level, so you can be as fast or as methodical as you'd like. Plenty of safe spots on each of the screens and no need for memorization of any kind make the game utterly enjoyable, even if not especially complex. Now, despite what I said, Naughty Ones' simplicity don't make it easy. It's quite difficult in fact, the latter levels especially, but never unfair. So if you take your time, approach them strategically, you should be able to complete the game no problem. Graphics and sounds are pretty good too, so they nicely round up the game's package into a singular, very enjoyable experience. Oh, and best of all, Naughty Ones can be played in simultaneous multiplayer, which is nearly always the best way any game can be appreciated. Agent CZ, aka Agent Czesio, is an extremely basic, obscure Polish platformer. Not basic because it's Polish, but because, well, it just is. Surprisingly devoid of variety is what I'm trying to say here. It only ever released in Polish, but despite that you don't really need to read or understand anything in it, as it's as simple to play as it is to bake a cake. And if you don't know how to make one, it's that simple. To make a cake, you take a cake and then you make it. Period. I know, cringe, but it's more of a joke for me rather than for you. I just adore its idiotic simplicity. Anyway, Agent CZ is a gather all objects, time your jumps well and avoid obstacles kind of a game. And that's precisely what you will be mainly doing, other than looking for something else to play, that is. And it's also a perfect example of a late-budget Amiga title, that there's nothing wrong about per se, but also nothing spectacular about it either. It seems as if it was made just because it could be made and some money could be earned by its sales. Not because someone had a vision and wanted to release a great Amiga platformer. It's a game that you may fire up and complete once, maybe twice if you're bored beyond belief, but after that, you will definitely never get back to it again. Does it mean it's a bad one? Not necessarily, but it's aggressively average or even a little below it. And a title that's not really worth tracking down if you don't already have it in your library. Agent's graphics are uninspired and quite disappointing too. Colorful, but somehow also bland looking. I know, makes no sense, but just look at them. Can't they be both in the same time? It feels that they can. Sounds and music are pretty bad too, so I won't get into any more details about them. So, make what you want of what I just said. Play it or not, in this particular case, I couldn't care less. The Last Soldier is a side-view action platformer set during the World War II, and it starts off with one of the most terrible intros that I've seen on the Amiga. But fortunately, it's not the intro that makes the game, it's the content and gameplay that do it. And in the case of the latter two, The Last Soldier comfortably falls somewhere between average or slightly tiny itty-bitty above it, which is not a given for those late Polish releases. That said, The Last Soldier, surprisingly, is not terrible. You play as this commando type of a soldier who is sent into a Nazi bunker to turn on 4 reactors in it and then destroy it. As background stories go, it may not be the best, but it's a platformer, so it hardly needs one. Said bunker naturally is not standing there empty, waiting for you to send it into oblivion, but is full of enemies. And these can be soldiers, mini-tanks, turrets, rocket launchers, and many others. The variety is definitely not an issue here. You're equipped with an AK-47 and have to constantly feed it more bullets as they're not unlimited. You're reloaded by finding ammo boxes scattered around the bunker, but they're not the only pickups you'll get to grab on your adventure, as there are also medikits that replenish your health, petrol canisters, passkeys and access codes too, for that little environmental puzzling that most platformers have. Graphics-wise, it's not great. I mean, the presentation alone is subpar, but then there are the animations. And let me tell you, they're way below what you'd expect from the Amiga. That said, as odd as it sounds, you get used to it after a while, and it's not as annoying later on as it initially is. The bunker itself is a pretty huge maze, and since the game features no map whatsoever, you're either gonna have to attempt the impossible and memorize it, or resort to drawing a map of it by hand, like we used to for 8-bit games. Which, while tiresome, is actually a huge hit of nostalgia, if you get those that is. The Last Soldier is not a great game, but given all its shortcomings, I'd still say that it's worth a playthrough, as it's not as bad as it appears to be on the surface. So if you get a chance, at least give it a try. Maximum speed, maximum excitement, maximum fun, Max Rally, yeah! Cue the explosions, fireworks and some shots of fast cars racing Bruce. Bruce? Darn it, I keep forgetting that he's on holidays. Oh well, imagine all this here on the screen at once and a fast-paced racing music. Max Rally is a late Amiga public domain, top-down racer. And as these go, it's actually pretty fun. Though arguably by 1998 hardly anyone got to enjoy it nearly half a decade after Amiga's untimely demise. It features a single-player championship mode, which is the meat on the bones of the game, a time trial, which is self-explanatory, and 2 multiplayer modes, that I'll mention a bit later on. The championship mode is composed out of 5 levels, each consisting of 5 tracks, and it's up to you to decide which order you'd like to tackle them in. Every race pits you against 3 AI opponents, and whomever ends first after 12 laps wins. Christopher Lambert once said there can be only one, and whichever of you gets the reference is hella cool. Same in Max Rally. There's 4 of you on the track but only one winner, so if you don't come first, it's as if you lost regardless where you've placed. Between the regular levels there are also special challenge tracks on which you have to chase the screen, don't let it outrun you and don't fall off the edge of it. These are much more difficult than the regular races though, like many times more demanding, which makes Max Rally feel a bit uneven. That said, it's a public domain game with no large studio behind it, so it's easy to forgive such an annoying perhaps, but understandable lack of playtesting. In up to 4 racers multiplayer, you can either race to see who gets to the finish line first, or battle it out Micro Machines style for points, trying to race ahead enough to have your opponents disappear at the edge of the screen. Whomever gets 5 points first wins. And obviously it's the multiplayer that's most fun, but that's hardly a surprise, isn't it? Max Rally's graphics are pretty nice, though nothing groundbreaking, but the small cars and zoomed out viewpoint make for considerably easier gameplay than it otherwise would have been heavily zoomed in like Micro Machines for instance. Oh, and since we're on the classic, which of the two do you think is better? Do you think Max Rally can be as good or even better than Micro Machines? I hope that you said no, because it's not. But it's also not that far off, so if you like the Micro Machines, you like the Max Rally too. Alien Target is a rather obscure Polish sci-fi action arcade release and one of the better games from the country to come out so late in Amiga's life. It is also a side-scrolling first-person shoot-'em-up in vein of titles like Operation Wolf or Cabal, leaning towards the wolf more as your character is not visible on the screen. A scientist, Professor Jack L. Cholker, invented a time machine, which as most time machines do, allowed for traveling to both future and past. Unfortunately, in one of the early travels, he unknowingly brought something back, namely aggressive aliens who by then learned where the Earth was. And let me tell you, it took them a short minute to conquer the planet. That's how unprepared we were. At that point, when all of the planet's military failed, the only possible solution for our blue marble to survive, the only way to save it against overwhelming and technically more advanced force, was to resort to employing help of the alien hunters. Hunters such as yourself, my brave, tough and more dangerous than Riddick viewer. It's not gonna be a walk in the park though, as the aliens stole the time machine and now appropriate it to conquer us in all times, making sure that we're not gonna be able to escape their strong and slimy grasp. They made one crucial mistake though. They underestimated you, and that was what will ultimately bring their demise. So, using the similar time machine, you'll be hunting them in ancient times, in the 19th century, in the present and future too. 4 stages, each placed in a different time and setting. The new enemy appears on the screen every few seconds and his location is always indicated on your scanner, and you have to direct yourself to it scrolling in the appropriate direction, making sure to dispose of it and any others before you run out of energy, keeping tabs on all of them so that they wouldn't overwhelm you. And since we're on the subject, you can replenish the energy, ammo and your grenades by shooting tokens containing set power-ups. Naturally, Alien Target is neither most ambitious nor the best shoot-'em-up out there, but it's decent enough to provide some fun and a lot of action. And if you enjoy these crosshair mouse controlled games, you're gonna like it. Blobs is part lemmings, part worms, and part something entirely different, and I can't put my finger what that something else is. At least not yet. Simply put, it's a puzzle game where you have to lead a group of blobs to safety while avoiding any and all dangers by using a set of different commands that can be issued to them. All within a time limit, obviously. Blobs, so those tiny round green and squishy balls with floating eyes, behave identically to lemmings, so they will just happily go forwards if not directed otherwise, even if it will mean them going straight towards the eternal sleep. To put it nicely. At the bottom of the screen, same as in Lemmings, there's a set of buttons, each corresponding to a particular skill that you can assign to each and every little blob. And they're quite varied too, from jump through dig to a shot that destroys obstacles in our creature's way, kinda like a bazooka shot in Worms. Additionally, not all levels are straightforward start to exit first, and some of them have objectives, like the requirement to collect a number of items on your way or destroying specific installations. Even more so, not all skills are available initially, and some must be picked up throughout the level to be able to use them later on. I think saying that Blobs is same but different to Lemmings is the best way to describe the game, even if it often feels much faster than the Lemmings are. The developer of Crystal Dragon, Magnetic Fields, by 1994 had quite a few games in their portfolio. I mean, titles like Lotus Turbo Challenge Trilogy, Supercars 1 and 2 were pretty well known and respected. And yet, much different than Crystal Dragon. That is a first-person dungeon-crawling RPG heavily inspired by the legendary classic Dungeon Master. Story-wise, you play as a duo of adventurers who set off to find and defeat the evil wizard that erected a fortress around the titular crystal. Crystal, which power he's trying to harness to rule the world. Whatever you want to say about the Gandalf wannabe, he is ambitious. Now, it's perhaps not the most novel or captivating story out there, but it's good enough as a basis for a dungeon crawler. So once again, you move in steps, each covering one square on a built-in auto-map and turned by 90 degrees only. It's perhaps an older and less atmospheric approach to the genre, especially by 1994, but it's one that was relatively easy for the Amiga to still handle comfortably. The game allows you to compose your duo of adventurers out of a typical for the genre classes of warrior, paladin, thief, assassin, cleric and magician. And while all combinations are feasible, if you're careful, methodical in how you play, not all are equally as effective and not all progress at the same pace. So, while some may feel weaker initially, it doesn't mean that they're not gonna be stronger than others later. They may just require more attention, care, and a lot more saves coming. For a fairly balanced first playthrough, however, I'd recommend going with tried and tested Armored Brawler with a caster pairing. They may not be the most versatile or even the strongest at the end game choice, but they're the most rounded up pick for the beginning, and a classic that should allow you going through the whole story start to finish without issue. The game is composed out of 23 dungeons, some of which are split into smaller ones for a total of 63 levels to crawl through, and dozens upon dozens of various unique bodies to beat. Those fights will be very difficult when you start up, and it will take a while before your characters grow into the task they're supposed to perform eventually. So make sure to save often and keep few of those saves running. You know, just in case. Other than the combat, you'll naturally have to tackle tons of different puzzles of various difficulty, some logic-based and others purely environmental. All fun though. And you also have to remember about resting, feeding and watering of your duo of heroes so that they would stay alive. Graphics and sounds are rather good, even if not spectacular, but the true highlight of the Crystal Dragon is the gameplay, which after you get used to it and bulk up your party a little, will be hella fun. I mean, in what other game could you use a death rat as a weapon? Bolomrów Kojet, which is actually pronounced Bolomrów Kojat, is a Polish side-scrolling platformer. You play as an anteater and have to complete 5 increasingly difficult stages, avoiding various creatures and different obstacles. Touching any of these causes you to lose a life and returns you to the last checkpoint. That said, Bolomrów Kojat is a very simple, basic even game, where there's no weapons, no power-ups or pickups, and all you have to do is to get to the end of each stage, timing your jumps properly and avoiding bodies carefully. Nothing more, nothing less. The graphics are nice and colorful, the animation is smooth, and overall the game looks pretty decent. That said, it was also released in 1997, long after Amiga officially ceased to exist, and it only ever came out in Polish. It's a platformer though, and one that does not require learning any complicated mechanics, gameplay concepts, or even background story, so not having any knowledge of the language should not really be a factor in deciding if you should play it or not. I feel that it's really decent for what it is, even if not necessarily for me being as simple as it is design-wise, and too little too late to have any real impact on Amiga's gaming scene. Dragon Fighter is an interesting, though unspectacular, horizontally scrolling fantasy-themed shoot-'em-up, in which you fly on the back of the dragon like you would have rode a pony, exploring 5 different areas, completing dozens of levels and visiting towns between them. Why do you do that? Well, for one, because you can, and that's as good reason as any, and for two, because apparently if you complete all stages and free the land of all the bodies, you will become the new king. And who wouldn't want to be a king? Well, me. I wouldn't, at least not then and there, but that's a story for another time. And there's plenty reasons not to be one, trust me. There's the toilets, or lack thereof really, high cholesterol, fatty and unhygienically prepared food, arranged marriages, death from a rusty nail, and, well, a dragon. And that's just scratching the surface. So, you fly through the stages fighting various interestingly designed enemies, and depending on how many you annihilate, you are giving a monetary compensation after level completion. The money can be spent in towns on upgrades to your weapon, which may sound odd when talking about the dragon that breathes fire, but it is what it is. Perhaps it's extra sulfur that you're buying, or oil, I don't know. Important thing is that it works. And you can also get extra speed and life energy so that you would be more resistant to damage. And since there's no lives in Dragon Fighter and you only have one, same as in real life, it's worth to keep that energy at reasonably high level. Other than that, there's only dice gambling in taverns in towns, and it can as easily multiply your spending budget as it can shrink it, even down to zero. So, approach it only when in the most dire of needs. That said, if I'm to be honest, the gambling bit is totally unnecessary. Not because it's gambling, I have no problem with that, but because it literally is not necessary. It adds nothing and is nothing special whatsoever. The more you play Dragon Fighter, the sooner you realize that other than the towns arranged in a diamond-shaped map and dragon riding gimmick, there's not much there elevating the game over dozens of other shooters on the Amiga. Sure, it looks and sounds decent, even if nothing out of ordinary, but even that, along with average at best gameplay, does not make Dragon Fighter any better than the competition. And that's why, if I'm to be honest, I'd wager a guess that not many played it or even knew of it either. The City of Death, aka Miasto Śmierci in its original Polish, is an obscure late 1996 sci-fi action shooter. And while it's not spectacular in any way imaginable, it's not an absolute stinker as many other of those very late low-budget games were. A mad scientist wants to take over the world, so given the quality of the gaming subject, I'd call him, let's say, a budget Lex Luthor. Lex Luth, with OR missing because of the lack of finance. And you're the secret agent who's given literally no choice but to jump behind the remote controls of a modern bipedal battle robot called Moa and stop him. Preferably in that particular order. Moa is armed with 5 different weapons. No. I think I got it wrong. Let me start again. Moa is armed with 5 identical weapons, only distinguishable between each other with the sound that they make and perceivable power. Yes, that sounds way better. The gameplay takes place on 2 separate planes. First is quote-unquote overworld labyrinth-like map of the titular city, where you move between different sectors. It's also where, with a bit of luck, you may find ammo for weapons other than the most basic one, which has unlimited supply of it. Then there are the battle screens to which the game switches whenever there's enemy force in one of the aforementioned sectors and combat begins. These are usually pretty detailed, depicting blocks of apartments in various stages of degradation and generally speaking don't look bad other than using very limited yellow-brownish palette for whatever the reason. This is where you face the enemies Operation Wolf style, and despite being a very simplified version of the classic, those combat bits are actually kinda enjoyable, for what they are, that is. So you shoot tons of bodies there, some of them are exploding in fiery blaze cause they're cyborgs, while others, well, there's no other way going around it, also explode but in pools of blood, cause they're humans, I think. Perhaps androids. I didn't look too deep into the game's near non-existent lore. To complete the stage/zone, you have to kill a certain number of enemies, and when you do, the game comes back to the overhead map, regardless if there were any enemies left on the screen or not. Which is at the very least odd, but whatever. So, not to waste any more of your time, that's pretty much it. Nothing more to this little game. If you liked Operation Wolf or Cabal, you can check it out, there's a chance you'll find it in yourself to complete it, but if you didn't, there's not much here else for you. Missiles over Zirion is a very modern, for its time at least, missile command clone. It's not just a straight-up copy though, but an expansion of the original idea, which while being heavily built upon, is still true to the original game's roots. Same as in the arcade classic, the aliens are attacking. This time, however, it's not Earth, but City of Zirion on one of our colonies. And said attack is more than effective. It is estimated that in one sweep wave, all but 2,000 of citizens have been wiped out. Given the enemy's overwhelming forces and the fact that you're busy saving the world somewhere, in some other game most likely, perhaps even alien target that we spoke about today, all we can do is defend ourselves. But perhaps, if we manage to do it efficiently enough, we'll be able to repel the alien scum forces. We'll see. Unlike in the original, Zirion does not see us defending multiple cities, but only the titular one. which is not a surprise as you're not here and despite how hard we try, we can never measure up to your skill level. And 1 is pretty much all we can protect without your help. That said, given the seriousness of the situation and your absence, we are given a chance to arm the city with various stronger and deadlier weapons, like heavy metal or even nuclear missiles, different types of bombs, or even get an energy storage expansion or faster recharge of it for the city. Which may sound cryptic, but in the simplest of terms explainable, means fuel for the force field protecting the city. Because yes, there is one too. Interestingly enough, Zirion is not attacked with missiles only, but by various types of projectiles, bombs, or even by the enemies directly arriving in deadly waves. All that makes for a very fun and fresh feeling take on the classic. And coupled with stellar presentation, it's a very enjoyable and action-packed game which no doubt will provide hours of fun to all fans of the original. Why only them and not everyone though? Cause by 1994, and even more so today, in 2024, missile command formula feels very dated. And even in rehashed, upgraded form as it is served in Zirion, under all of its improvements, holds the same general gameplay idea which may not be as popular so many years later anymore. I think it's fine, you know, but I've played the original in arcades too, so I have a lot of sentiment to its formula. But not everyone is me. And even I can't play it longer than 2-3 games at a time, before feeling of unease and repetition sets in, heavily impacting the fun factor. While I always considered its successor to be much better game, Skidmarks is pretty good on its own too. It's an isometric top-down view racer for up to 4 players and it offers selection of 4 cars. But to be able to have them all on the screen at once, you need a system with at least 2.5 MB of RAM. Otherwise, whatever you choose, everyone will use, player or computer alike, and there'll be no variety in vehicles other than the color. Which is a bit disappointing, but I suppose there had to be some kind of hardware limitations that required the additional memory to load all the assets. Or perhaps there was no compression routines, or maybe even the programming language of choice, Blitz Basic, is the culprit here. It's hard to tell now years later, being nothing more than a former player of the game. But these are my best guesses, at least for the time being. Anyway, all 12 tracks are circuits with no sprint races available, but they're quite fun to race on and reward mastering drifting. The corners are often sharp and devilishly difficult to take perfectly, and the jumps on some of them add to the randomness of gameplay and fun. If you play against others, that is, and not the CPU, that seems to be all over the place skill-wise. But more often than not, on the easier side. Graphically, the game looks okay, some would probably swear that it was amazing, but it never struck me as such. And it definitely looked better 2 years later in the form of Super Skidmarks, even if marginally better only. But it's worth noting that each car is made up of 800 sprites, which is 32 rotations with 5 pitches and elevations. And come to think of it, this may be the reason for the memory requirement of it. Who would have thought that when I came here to talk about the game, I would have also solved an old and time-forgotten mystery? What a day. If you have someone with you and all of you like top-down racers, it's definitely not one to skip. Given how many of those late Amiga releases, especially in the FPS genre, came from Poland, for a long while I was under the impression that Testament, today's gaming subject, was Polish too. While in fact it was developed by Insanity, later known as Bohemia Interactive, a Slovakia-based studio that was eventually incorporated into THQ. But that's a story for another video. Still, Testament is a very late Amiga FPS running on Insanity's in-house engine, which was surprisingly well put together and allowed for a pretty comfortable full-screen gameplay even on an unexpanded A1200. Sure, it benefited heavily from any and all upgrades you could throw at it, but even without them, it played smoother in full screen than virtually anything else in the genre at the time did. And all that with textured walls, floors and ceilings. Quite the achievement if you ask me. That said, in 1997 it was too little too late, and honestly, other than the 7 remaining hardcore fans in the wilds somewhere, still squeezing the last juices from on-life support by the Amiga, no one saw the game. I'm obviously exaggerating, especially that there was a sequel to it released a year later, but however you want to look at it, it was brave of Insanity to release games on Amiga by 1997 and 1998. Anyway, as you're on an expedition to uncover the crypt of ancient Magus Gupta, one of the most powerful sorcerers of the yore and the ruler of the entire empire from 4000 years before, you are separated from your group. And as soon as you are, the monstrosities arise and begin doing whatever's possible to kill you. Since you were an armed guard of the expedition, however, you are more than prepared to defend yourself. But are you prepared for the horror-like creatures and even confrontation with the evil Magus himself? Time will tell, if you decide to give Testament a go and complete it. Testament is a horror and macabre-themed first-person shooter set inside and outside of various catacombs, graveyards and dungeons, filled with many different nightmare-inducing monsters. And in that, it's more similar to Doom than any other sci-fi or war-themed FPSs of the time. It is composed out of 16 rather large but not too big levels, filled with depth to the brim and some very simple environmental puzzling for good measure too, usually centered around finding appropriate colored keys for the same colored doors. While there is only 4 weapons in Testament, so a gun, machine gun, fireball and so-called double, which for all intents and purposes is just a more powerful fireball. The variety of enemies, fluidity of gameplay, atmosphere and fun factor more than make up for a lack of diverse armament. If that wasn't enough, it is clear from the get-go that a lot of thought went into gameplay design and pacing, as the difficulty curve grows steadily, allowing you to learn everything and grasp the controls ahead of throwing more demanding stuff at you. It's a perfect shooter for a basic A1200, and I don't think that any fan of Amiga and the genre should overlook this late hidden gem. Simply put, Traps and Treasures is fantastic, and you can quote me on that. It may not be as big or as full of secrets and hidden passages as Super Frog, or as compulsive and random as Robocop 2 is, but it doesn't have to be, as it's an entirely different kind of a platformer. It's not a game where you travel through huge multiple screen spawning and 4-way scrolling levels, it's more linear and straightforward. Sure, it scrolls always, but the levels are shorter and more contained. Objective-wise, all you have to do is save your crewmates and get to the end of each level. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, this may sound simple, boring and perhaps repetitive even, but believe me, it's anything but. Traps and Treasures is pretty difficult and requires ninja-like reflexes at times, but it's also incredibly fun and rewarding. On your way you'll encounter many different pirate and marine-themed enemies and obstacles, all beautifully designed and super smoothly animated. And since we're on the presentation, it's great. The game is colorful and has its own very unique graphical style that I'm not sure I've seen in any other titles. Pretty cool addition to it all is seemingly active or at least smartly scripted music system that switches tracks in very specific situations, for instance when going underwater to a more nautical suiting melody. The swashbuckling piratey atmosphere is spilling through the screen when playing Traps and Treasures, and for the life of me, I cannot fathom a guess why Traps and Treasures didn't get a wider recognition and popularity. Maybe because it wasn't as well known outside its country of origin or had a limited advertising. Or maybe it was something else. In the end, it was just not in the cards for it. Despite that, it's definitely one of the best platformers on the Amiga and a game I enjoy coming back to, even if only to fail a couple levels in. Ruffian is an always scrolling action platformer and an unusual one at that. Why? Cause while it seemingly was developed in 1994, it wasn't released until 1996. It's hard to tell what's the reason behind such a delay, but it meant that when it finally dropped, there were maybe 7 or 8 Amiga users left overall, and 3 of them were living in a jungle, in a remote location using their A500s as bookends. Perhaps weirdly shaped and huge bookends in a place where there were no books, but bookends nonetheless. I'm obviously exaggerating, everyone knows that there were at least couple hundred Amiga gamers still left by then, and all of them lived in Poland, Germany and UK. Okay, I gotta stop it, it's neither correct nor getting us anywhere. But the point still stands. 1996 was way too late for an Amiga game to release and make any real impact on the system's gaming scene. Ruffian is composed out of 17 jungle-themed levels, which while scrolling in all 4 directions are actually built to mainly move vertically. Kinda like those in Rainbow Islands do, but on a much larger scale. And your task is to find and locate all pixies in each level and then get to the exit. All naturally within a constantly ticking and unforgiving timer. Little fellas are caught up in carnivorous plants scattered around the levels, and to save them you have to kill the plants by spitting at them with seeds. Like a jungle hoodlum that you are. There are tons of various pickups dotted around the level, stuff like jewels, gold cups, potions and spells, and grabbing them can obviously help you on your adventure. These grant our hero additional powers like higher jump, rapid fire spray, invincibility and quakes to name a few, and are more than helpful in completing the game, especially that it's a buddies galore. And any and all creatures that you'll meet, other than the pixies that is, are all out to get you. Graphically, Ruffian doesn't look too bad, but in the same time it also doesn't look 1996 good either. It's decent, but nothing special. And animation especially could use a bit more work as it feels a bit floaty. In conclusion, Ruffian is an interesting even if unspectacular platformer, and if you like this and don't mind rather unforgiving timer, you'll have quite a lot of fun in this one. There's one thing that makes Super Gems or Gem Z special among all other games in this video. What, you may wonder? Well, unlike every single other game here, Super Gems was never released. In fact, we should not talk about it here because it shouldn't exist. The game's release was cancelled when its source code was stolen from the developers, Keiko, at a computer fair in 1992. So while it's considered a 1992's game, all versions that could be found online now are its stolen bootlegged copies. Today it bears no legal weight really, but it's an interesting little fact about it, don't you think? Story-wise, when Her Majesty's crown jewels were stolen by a master thief, a quartet of heroes was summoned by her to recover them. So they embark on an epic puzzling adventure spanning over 104 increasingly difficult levels. Super Gems is a mixture of Keiko's earlier Gem X and Bomberman, with tons of power-ups and beautiful anime presentation. It also features one of the most unusual approaches to the puzzlers that I've ever seen. Namely, all levels can be completed by either one person or even up to 4 playing cooperatively. And you could say that there's plenty of games that allow for simultaneous 4-player cooperation, but riddle me this. Name one that happens to be a puzzler. Exactly. The Strangers are folks you should never have your kid pick up sweets from. You can easily recognize them by their greasy hair, crazy eyes and the fact that they're basically living in their vans, filled with candy and questionable for a grown-up toys. Coincidentally, it is also a side-scrolling beat-em-up on the Amiga that's actually pretty good, and equally as brutal and bloody as Franco or Doman were, perhaps more. It only ever came out on AGA Amigas using the system's chips to the fullest, but, and it's gonna be a big but, pun intended, it came out in 1997. So same as Ruffian I've spoke about today, a bit too late to make a difference and resurrect the Amiga. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my Amiga, it's the system I have most fond memories of, but let's not kid ourselves. After 1995, the quality and number of games released for it went down dramatically, and few and far between decent titles were not a norm but an exception. The Strangers is basically your Double Dragon / Target Renegade of yore, but with more variety and bucketfuls of blood. Story-wise, in a dystopian near future when the world is rather rundown, plagued by criminality, offers no social security or support system whatsoever, the gangs rule the cities. A notorious mafia boss is in hiding and rules your city with an iron hand. You play as a member of a, and I shit you not, positive gang that bases all they stand for in being just and good. Yup, a gang. Anyway, you plead to find the mafia boss and end his reign, and you will do it going through 8 rather long and chock full of enemies levels. While the sprites are not overly big, they are presented on a not bad pre-rendered backgrounds, and there can be an impressive number of them on a screen at once, at times even around 8. And in beat-em-ups on Amiga, it usually never went over 4 or 5-ish. So, having so many moving enemies at once is definitely fresh feeling and adding to the atmosphere of going alone against a city of thugs. You are not defenseless on your quest, however, as other than your repertoire of kicks and punches, there are a lot of weapons you get to find, pick up and use. So stuff like knives, chains and hockey clubs will be of immense help to you. As you by now no doubt have noticed already, my saying that the Strangers serve gore by the bucket was not an exaggeration, and it actually is incredibly brutal all throughout. There are even finishers that the enemies can pull off on you to decapitate you or kill in other gruesome ways Mortal Kombat style. Graphically, Strangers are fine, though the animation is a bit stiff, especially all the attacks feel as if they were animated by someone who've never seen a human in motion. But I may be wrong, and it's just a spiritual callback to the aforementioned Target Renegade. In the end, if you enjoy brawlers, this one's definitely worth a look. Venom Wind is a side-scrolling shoot-em-up, and believe it or not, it has a story. Same as in real life, in Venom Wind, you're a veteran combat pilot and one of the best that there ever were actually. Probably the best even. And you've seen it all, hordes of enemies, armies of evil, bases of numerous tyrants, nothing could stop you. But there's one challenge that no one have ever lived to complete and go through. A challenge that holds supposedly unimaginable riches within. Now, being as experienced and decorated as you are, money means nothing to you. You've plenty enough already. But the challenge of the Fortress network, now that's something you're very much into. The game is composed out of 4 levels, each being one of the 4 fortresses in the network, and each of them is a bit different. Levels 1 and 3 are largely static, keeping you on the same screen at all times and scrolling the background downwards, while levels 2 and 4 are more traditional horizontally scrolling, R-type style. All of them, however, feature a design mixture of sci-fi with organic and a steady onslaught of enemies, mechanical and odd, like flying ice for instance. Each level ends with a boss fight, and these are usually bigger and more intricate than the regular enemies and may require pattern memorization to beat. Unfortunately, where Venom Wind succeeded in novelty, it also fails in power-ups, offering just a few of these. namely a triple shot, which is exactly what it sounds, a satellite drone, which does what these do in all other shooters, but when played in simultaneous multiplayer, it can actually be controlled by the second player, which is more fun. And finally, a transformation into an eagle, which gives you a temporary invincibility. As you see, there's not many, but perhaps the devs thought that the ingenuity of their design would make up for it. It doesn't. I mean, Venom Wind is not a bad game, I actually find it quite fun, but it's so difficult, man. Even the first level is a challenge to go through. So few extra, preferably more powerful or versatile weapons would be a huge help. If you're a fan of shoot 'em ups though, I don't have to convince you. Venom Wind is definitely worth a playthrough. But if you're on a fence, ask yourself if you enjoy being challenged. And then try it out only if you do. Tyran, which is actually pronounced Tyran, is a late Polish take on Moonstone formula. Now, I don't have to tell you that it's not as good, but what I will tell you is that it's pretty decent actually. I'd say it's in the front half of the average, not quite good yet, but definitely not an absolute stinker. Unlike Moonstone, however, it is single player only and in Polish. First made it virtually a single playthrough game, and second reduced its potential pool of players in 1996 from tiny to nearly non-existent. So yeah, congrats to the dev on their efforts. Anyway, the goal of the game is to defeat the titular Tyran. To do so, however, you have to find, secure and bring 3 magical items to the altar. These are an hourglass, a magic map and a book of birth, whatever that may be. So, same as in the original, for the most part you'll wandering around the map, entering lairs where the enemies are and then teaching them not to breathe anymore, usually with a sword as your prime educational assistant. These locations are marked with color that represent their difficulty level and by extension of that, how many enemies can you expect to find there. Defeating the enemies rewards items, losing costs you gold. Both you and the enemies are described by series of statistics of energy, strength, stamina, resistance and blow. And that last brings few things to mind. None of them kids friendly though, and I'm pretty sure that the devs just made that stat funny sounding unintentionally. Unless one of them was a comedy genius, then yeah, blow it is. During fights you have 7 attacks that you can perform to bring the opponents down to his knees, block and escape, cause you never know. Combat encounters are terrible. They're like Moonstone mixed with Street Fighter, short of special moves, fluidity and fun. And generally speaking, combat feels clunky and annoying, which is not a good sign in a game that bases most of its appeal on it. There are 3 classes that you can pick for your character when starting, and they influence your initial stats and wealth. Other than the lairs, there are also other neutral locations that you can visit, places like the inn, mage tower, mage hut, altar, but you knew of this one already, nursing home, old mine, castle, lake tower and forest tower. There are 6 types of different swords and armor to equip and use, 10 spells and few magical and medicinal items. Tyran had a few interesting ideas, I'll give it that, but it feels like the devs were very fired up when they started working on it and then gradually lost the drive and just pushed through the tears to finish the game. Other than the gameplay, it's most noticeable in the presentation that mixes pre-rendered static images with digitized characters and raster pixel graphics. It looks as if there were 3 different artists working on it, each wanted to do their own thing, and then they put it all together without trying to blend it in any reasonable way. I'm not stupid, I know that it's not the case here, it just feels like it. Correction, I am stupid, but despite that, I know that it's not the case. Anyway, Tyran is an interesting game to check out if you liked Moonstone, and one worth experiencing at least once. Is it worth completing or playing longer? I'm not sure. Personally though, I am not coming back to it. Virocop is a top-down view shooter, not unlike much more well-known Chaos Engine. It is, however, a game released at the very tail end of the Amiga's commercial life, or a year after Commodore went bankrupt, so it's a very polished production both in terms of sound and graphics. Level design is also spectacular, with stages being vast and varying considerably in enemies and bosses alike. Themes of the world that you'll visit shooting your way through hundreds of enemies, leaving none alive behind, will be sports, urban jungle, gods, adventure and Silicon Valley. Same as with other similar titles, you have numerous weapons to choose from and they can be upgraded for even more firepower if you land on these that you enjoy. Nice touch are the end of the world bosses that are all appropriately themed to the areas that they represent, entirely different to one another and all having their individual unique mechanics. Oh, and did I mention that you're a robot named Dave? I mean, who wouldn't wanna play as a robot named Dave? Dave the Brave. Because you're gonna be controlling him, so he ain't afraid of no ghost. Anyway, Virocop is quite difficult, its stages are overflowing with enemies, and even though at times it may feel a bit overwhelming, the game's so good that it never even borders on being frustrating. The addition of simultaneous multiplayer mode, where one of the players controls Dave's movement while the other is shooting, is an interesting design choice and a fun concept. especially that when there's none there with you, it can be used by a single person in a twin-stick Robotron style mode. Virocap is fun, go and play it. T-Zero is a side-view horizontally scrolling shoot 'em up, and it's probably the closest thing Amiga ever got to a bullet hell shooter that I know of, even if it came too late to save the system. At first it may not seem like it, but T-Zero tends to on occasion drop so many enemies at you at once that it's hard to tell what's happening, which some may call a bad game design and others call it a bullet hell. Oh, and since it requires at least a 68030 CPU with 8MB of RAM, it never slows down and keeps the frantic pace regardless of what's going on the screen. And there's usually a lot. There's quite a few weapons to choose from or pick up really in the form of power-ups, but when you find what you like, what you work best with, it's better not to go for anything else, as picking a wrong one will not only switch to it, but also serve it to you at the lowest possible level of power. It's also something to keep an eye for, cause these power-ups can cluster in one spot, and there can be more than one occupying the same few pixels on the screen. There are 3 different ships to choose from, and each level has 2 possible routes you can take to complete it. T-Zero is an amazing shooter. That's not only a very late addition to Amiga's library, but also one that came with a hefty spec requirements. So, unless you own a very powerful Amiga, which is anything but affordable today, you'll have to run it through emulation, which I consider to be the best way to play the system today anyway. But I know that some purists would never go for it. Oh, and it goes without saying that you should definitely try it out. And when you're done with all the stages, you can even design some of your own with an included level editor, which is just a cherry on top of this already sweet pie of a game. Games like Transplant make me wonder how names for the games back in the day were conceived. I mean, it's a space shooter that feels like a mix of Asteroids and any other generic sci-fi shoot 'em up, and yet the devs decided that Transplant was the name for it. I mean, there's gotta be a reason, right? Maybe because it's a concoction of ideas transplanted from other games to make this odd and playable mix, or perhaps the devs just sat at the table, wrote all the ideas down, threw them in a hat and pulled the first one out. I suppose we'll never know. One way or another, Transplant is an arcade shooter in top-down 360 degrees viewpoint, where you're free to fly around the map destroying rocks and various enemies. When all objects in a particular level are destroyed, you move to the next one. Since the movement is free, it may have been tough to locate that last small enemy hidden somewhere in the corner of the map, so you have a radar. But unlike other games in the genre, it's not a rectangle on the side or top of the screen, but rather dots surrounding your ship. Each dot represents one target that needs to be cleared, and its distance to your ship corresponds proportionally to the real distance between the two. Transplant starts with 3 lives, and you can upgrade your ship or buy more lives between the levels for money that you earned during battles. Flexibility, power and shields can be raised through said upgrades, and each of them has 5 levels of quality. Rather inventively, Transplant features a very interesting password system. When your last life is lost, you receive a password for that stage, and when you restart from that point, you not only have a full set of lives, but also all your upgrades has been sold off, and you're left with the monetary equivalent to upgrade your ship. This time perhaps with another combination of those parts to not fail again. If you like shooters, check Transplant out, it's really fun. Virtual karting is a proof that by 1995 Amiga still could, if the devs only wanted it to. But what could it do? Well, offer smoothly playing and using modern technologies racing game for its time at least. Unfortunately, as it came out, it only proved to be a concept that it never fulfilled. It features only 3 rather boring and entirely flat tracks, no multiplayer mode, and the AI is trash, serving more as an obstacle to overcome rather than the competitor to race against. Sure, you get to see the track overview before racing on it, to familiarize yourself with all the turns, but it hardly saves the game from being another boring and bland racer. And the graphics? I mean, some will probably praise them for being full 3D and textured mapped, but to me they look like jumbled mess of washed out colors and dithering galore. I think it's clear by now that I don't like it. And I'd rather play nearly any other racer on the Ami, like Lotus 2 for instance. But despite me not having a lot of good to say about it, I have to give it credit where it's due. And virtual karting, on its minimum requirement 81200, runs very smoothly. And the handling is pretty good when you get used to it. When you finally do, you'll realize quickly that you went through all the tracks that it had to offer and there's hardly any incentive to keep playing. Whether you want to give it your time, it's your call, I wouldn't. For all intents and purposes, Z-Wolf 2 Wild Justice is a 3D helicopter shooter. It is not, however, one of those extremely hectic shooters where there are thousands of enemies charging at you from all sides, but one that's considerably slower and more strategic, especially because each mission has its own set of objectives and controls require practice and getting used to. But when you do, it's a blast to play, apparently. Z-Wolf 2's missions range from simple search and destroy ops to protection of tank groups, and the game can be controlled either by joystick or a mouse. There are a few kinds of weapons available to lay destruction on the enemy forces, and both weapons and fuel are finite, so refueling and purchasing of additional armament may be necessary mid-mission on some of those longer assignments. Z-Wolf 2 was made with all Amigas in mind, so the 3D untextured shadowed viewpoint is kept at a very limited size to hold acceptable frame rate on all possible configurations. Naturally, basic A500 and 600 are hardly beasts to give it a lot to work with, but it can be said that Z-Wolf 2 is unplayable on them. Back in the day, Z-Wolf's graphics were considered very good, innovative even. Today, they're fugly at best. But such is life. As much as 2D graphics hold the quality and look pleasantly for decades, like a fine wine, early 3D games age terribly and just look awful. Gameplay-wise, Lemon Amiga users seem to love the game and praise its quality and fun factor. Personally, I didn't dig it too much, as I only had an A500 and it felt too slow for me. So, it's another one of those games you best make your own mind about it. Swords and Galleons is kinda like Sid Meier's Pirates, but not as good, and despite what I just said, it's not bad at all, it's just different, and lacks that hard to quantify magical touch of Sid, however that may sound. The islands of Red Coral Sea were a peaceful and prosperous archipelago under the rule of a beautiful and just queen. The trade was blooming, the citizens were rich and thriving, and the peace and harmony were sustained by the queen's kindness. The idyll couldn't last forever, and one day it was unexpectedly and brutally broken by the pirates led by a vicious leader going by the name of Varisco. They appeared seemingly out of nowhere, conquered the region, forced the islanders into submission, and worst of all, kidnapped and imprisoned the queen in a cave of mystical Skull Island, casting the spell on the cave, preventing anyone from ever entering. While it's seemingly possible to break the spell, it requires a lot from whomever attempts to do it. First of all, he or she would have to find 5 legendary treasures hidden around the islands, then vanquish the Varisco and his evil pirate forces, and finally locate and secure magical crystal ball. Over the years many tried, but none succeeded. Fortunately, years later, you came around, and you're the badass the queen needed to be saved. And you will do it. Don't question it, it's been said on the video, so it's gotta be the truth. Everyone knows that if something's written or on a video, then it's an unquestionable and undisputable fact. Note that down. But just because it's a given and you will save the queen, it doesn't mean that it will happen straight away just like that, willy-nilly with no effort on your end. Oh no. It will be a process, believe me. Especially that you start with a small ship, map of the islands and like literally $10 to your name only. So you'll need to trade and carry passengers allowed to work out a budget for your mission. You can sink other ships too, there's some money to make in that as well, or even search for treasures. In the end, it's not important how you get there, it's important that you do. Overall, if you plan to be ready to defeat Varisco, you'll need money, and your ship will have to be not only fully crewed, but also fitted with the best cannons and sails on the market. So while the first part of the game is all on board of your ship, the second will see you in the Skull Cave swashbuckling your way to the beautiful queen, who, if not for the magical spell, would be an old lady by now. Swords and Galleons is not only true to its title, but also a pretty fun game, and if you liked Sid Meier's original or are into things piratey, you'll love it. Following their previous game, Brutal Sports Football, the Q Software released World Cup Soccer in 1994. Unlike the previous title, however, this one sports a bit more modern isometric view. Soccer, or football really, it's not a game that requires a lot of explanation, but I'll give you a simplified rundown. You've got 11 players on each side, 2 goals and 1 ball. The aim is to get the ball into opposition's goal as many times as possible, in the same time sustaining as few goals as you can yourself, all the while simulating as many injuries as possible. That's the real football/soccer. In our today's game, there are a few small changes to the standard rules, however. Nothing major really. I mean, for one, fouls are not punished, they are actually sorta rewarded, as you're incapacitating the opponent for a short or a very long while, like permanently. So you can tackle opposition from behind to your heart's content, aim for the most vital organs if possible, and if situation allows for that, you can even resort to stabbing, maiming or beheading. Also, the beheading alone is worth 200 grand, and that's not spare change. I mean, your opponents knew what they were doing when they entered the pitch in a game against you. It's their fault. Money earned can naturally be spent between the matches on sex, drugs and booze. Nope, sorry, wrong game, wrong video, ignore it. I mean that it can be spent on arming your players, because of course weapons are allowed in World Cup Soccer. It has Wild in the title after all. Other than that, there are 3 game modes available: Unfriendly Match, which is just a single game against another team; League, the best part of the game, where you aim to grab the first spot in the first league, starting in the second, and the difference between them, opponent skill-wise, is gigantic. So even if you're doing quite well in the first, prepare for the second to be a challenge. And finally, a World Cup, which is just a tournament mode. Same as in previous title, the match can end when the time is over, and whomever scored more wins. Or if one of the sides runs out of all the players. I mean, 11 decapitations is really not unheard of in World Cup Soccer. Even computer can pull it off if he really wants to. As you go through the leagues, and I assume that you'll be playing this mode when alone, you'll be able to purchase better players, arm them with numerous weapons, or even resurrect those that were unfortunate enough to play against a stronger team. Mind you, I did not say better. All in all, World Cup Soccer is quite fun, naturally best with a friend, and sadly, at least in my eyes, not as good as brutal sports football was. Either way, if you enjoyed the first, you'll probably like the second. And if you didn't, then try this one out, cause you never know. Sen, which literally translates to The Dream, is an obscure late Polish point-and-click adventure, and oh my days, is it bad. There were 2 trends in the early to mid-90s that took over the world of gaming. First were the Doom clone games. Everyone wanted to release an FPS and earn billions bazillions selling them, but since this required a very specific technological know-how and a lot of programming keeping in mind platform's capabilities, and Amiga was not the best suited for these games anyway, many devs decided to aim for the second, which was digitized graphics. They worked great in Mortal Kombat, a bit later on in many FMV games on PC. It was technically simple and easy to pull off choice. So, what was there to stop a few guys with a dream and a terrible camera from making a game? Nothing. And perhaps something or someone should. Because Sen is really bad. The whole game seemingly takes place in your dream from which you have to escape. By waking up, that is. It's easier said than done though, and you need to figure out how to do it. The majority of the game takes place in and around an old rundown house, with a few scenes on the beach or in cemetery among others. You can carry up to 8 items at a time, and some of them may require combining before use. Gameplay is timed using energy meter as a timer, and you can temporarily extend it when needed with a roll or an apple. Quite fortunately, Sen released in Polish only, so never really reached far outside of the country, and many potential buyers were spared the disappointment and monetary losses. I mean, the idea was there, perhaps something better could be built on it, with a little more development time or a budget bigger than a crate of beer and a couple of pizzas, but in reality, as it stands, what we've ended up with was an uninspired collection of really low quality digitized pictures with few interactive objects overlaid on them. And I know that in theory Amiga displayed only 32 colors at once, and that the pictures do use most of them short of what's spent on the interface. But given that the graphics are entirely static, the system was easily capable of utilizing either so-called EHB mode, which displayed 64 colors, or to be precise 32 with 32 half-bright shades of them, and it would work great, as the pictures would lose a lot of dithering. Or even better, a HUM mode, aka Hold and Modify, which displayed all 4096 colors the system supported. And yet, the devs went another way. In the end, unless you love terrible games or just have to play all adventure games that ever came out, ignore Sen, pretend that it never existed. Zombie Apocalypse 2 is not an ambitious title. It doesn't overwhelm you with its story, it's not bothering you with any overly complicated tasks to perform, and it does not require you to give it your full attention. In fact, you can play it with one hand while eating soup with another. But yet, you can play it at once on 2 separate Amigas, on 2 separate screens, mouse in each hand. I don't know why you would, but you can. In essence, it's a 10-15 minutes kind of a game that capitalizes on popularity of gore-filled titles like Mortal Kombat, not offering comparable depth or features. You fire it up when either thinking what other games to invest more time in, to let off some steam mindlessly killing thousands of zombies, or when you literally just have few minutes and desperately want to play something. And truth be told, it doesn't fail in any of these scenarios. It's however not a game that you'd want to spend a whole afternoon immersing yourself in, as there's no meat on the bones here really. Bad pun, I know. Let's move on. You pick it up, you shoot some zombies covering the screen with hundreds of rotting body parts and bucketfuls of blood, and then you move on to something better. If approached like that, you'll have no problem enjoying it in those short occasional bursts. Now, as you can clearly see, it's Operation Wolf kind of a game, where you control a crosshair, exterminating the zombies, left mouse button shoots your gun and right throws the grenade. Both are limited in number, so whenever you see extra supplies falling from the sky, don't hesitate to shoot them, as they will restock these. The game is that simple. In each level you get an X number of enemies to kill, and when you do, it's straight to the next stage. rinse and repeat, and then get bored with it. As someone who quite honestly can't play Operation Wolf or even Cabal for too long as I lose interest in their loop quickly, I'm not loving Zombie Apocalypse 2. It's far more repeatable than the two classics. But I can appreciate it for what it is, which is short, mindless fun and nothing more. There's nothing top about top wrestling. In fact, if we were to call things by what they are, it would be called an aggressively mid-wrestling. Because it is. Disappointing in most aspects, I mean. It can obviously be played both, in single or multiplayer, where up to 6 of you can grapple the joysticks in anger what you've been made to play. And if you're gonna think of trying it out, make sure to have someone with you, as it's not only a bit more bearable then, but also it's good to have someone else to suffer through this. There is only one ring in the game, and while the background graphics of it are rather nice, the lack of variety is more than noticeable. And if that wasn't enough, all 16 fighters that are available in the game vary in nothing other than the names and some superficial details in their clothing. Sure, they are spoofs of then famous WWF wrestlers and celebrities, but all of them have entirely identical sets of 12 moves and no signature attacks. That is what makes the game boring. Way more than the background that in most games I wouldn't have even noticed having fun with what was happening in the foreground. Graphics, especially when it comes to the wrestlers, are decent enough and sounds, well, are in the game. But while the sprites have that near cinemaware quality to them, they're far from enough to save the game that treats you like an idiot, giving you the illusion of choice by serving you 16 names to pick between, just to disappoint you a minute later when you realize that you're actually always playing the same boring-ass character. I think that Sierra Soccer was my most favorite football game on the Amiga. I'm not sure though, as there were one in the early 90s that I liked more, but for the life of me I can't recall the title now, and I'm not sure if it was on Amiga or PC. So yeah. Anyway, Sierra Soccer is difficult enough to pose a challenge, but accessible and easy to control, so that strategy, management and role-playing gamers like myself will not feel lost and powerless playing it. The game uses a 3D engine that, while not very sophisticated, is very simple for the end user to understand and grasp the control of, and makes taking all those free kicks and penalties a pure pleasure, as you can finally feel that you have the control over where the ball will be going, more or less. And yes, seasoned kickoff or sensible soccer players can probably aim the ball in their respective titles with pinpoint accuracy, but as I mentioned initially, I am and always was mainly a strategy and role-playing gamer, so those high-octane arcadey football games were beyond means of reasonable control for me. Sierra Soccer was somewhere in between my beloved football managers and arcade games. And that was, it seems, a sweet spot for me. In the end, all you need to know is that it's a very fun game, especially when played against a friend. Not as widely spread or well known as other footballing behemoths on the Amiga, but just as worth experiencing. Released in 1997, late in Amiga's life, The World of Magic is system-exclusive point-and-click adventure, and an average game at best, from a technical point of view that is. It is set in the magical world of Kawamun, and you play as Grandon, a teenage wizard wannabe. When your home village is raided by the goblins and no one comes to the rescue, along with all other villagers that survived, you're forced to flee a home and embark on a quest to find the real wizard, who will teach you in the arts of magic. Not necessarily black magic, but magic nonetheless. It's been pointed out on Lemon Amiga website in the comments section under the game that it may have been made using shareware tool called Graal. G-R-A-A-L. Graal. Wow, is that a spelling contest video now or what? Did I win anything? A trip to Tokyo, all expenses paid, please and thank you. Anyway, I can't dispute the claim, as from the presentation point of view, so graphics and sounds, it's way below what was a standard on the Amiga even 3-4 years before it released. You know, presentation hardly ever makes or breaks the game, so let's not judge the game by that. It was just an observation. Fortunately, the gameplay's all there. And the World of Magic is actually not bad. If you're a fan of the genre, it's definitely worth tracking and completing, especially that some dialogues are just hilarious. In fact, it's chock full of funny, often over-the-top crazy exchanges between the characters and edgy humor. That said, it definitely shouldn't be anyone's first point-and-click game, as it's very rough, unpolished, and generally speaking uneven. For adventure game newbies, personally, I'd recommend something from LucasArts. They're like solid 90-95% of the time. But this is good too if it's not your first rodeo. Anyway, most puzzles in the World of Magic are inventory-based and they're not overly demanding. And while the game is not a looker, the aforementioned dialogues are really what it's all about, as when you go over even few of them, you'll want to complete the game for shits and giggles if nothing else. And you should, as it's not a big time investment and can be completed in about an hour or two at most. And it will be a time well spent. Until I played Super Tennis Champs, I would have sworn that Great Courts 2 was the best tennis game for the Amiga. I'm not sure of it anymore because this is so playable. I'm not even sure if it's not the best tennis that I've played full stop, until the more modern 3D renditions of the sport were released, that is. I suppose that its lack of recognition and the fact that I've never even heard about it before I've researched it for another older video of mine can be attributed to its release date. 1995, after all, was a year when most Amiga users knew that Commodore was no more and they started moving to other platforms, mainly PC and PlayStation, I think. Anyway, as you can see, it looks and sounds appropriately good for the time, nothing particularly great or bad about its presentation. It's also amazingly addictive in multiplayer, in which up to 4 of you can play on a single Amiga, albeit with a custom parallel port adapter, but you can. In single player, it's very fast and quite challenging too, which, you know, in general for the fans of the sport is good, for the rest of us may prove a deterrent from playing. It's worth pushing through the difficulty though, as even scoring that first 15 is very rewarding, as it feels that you've really improved, even if just by a little. Interesting fact, there are some very basic rules of physics simulated in Super Tennis Champs, and your character, when charging for the ball, won't stop instantly and sort of slides for a tiny bit, losing the momentum. It's not game changing in any way, but it's a nice touch nonetheless. Worms: The Director's Cut is an enhanced version of the original, the very best version of the first title on any system, and Team 17's goodbye gift for the Amiga, on which they've built their fame and earned their stripes. While Director's Cut was made and released with AGA support only, completely abandoning smaller Amigas, on PC they were concurrently working on Worms 2. So when Amiga gamers got the best first Worms, PC was about to receive the very best Worms. Period. But what it actually is? I mean, I doubt that you don't know, but if you really are in the dark here, let me try to explain. In essence, it's a 2D artillery style game where your team of worms is randomly placed on a also randomly generated fully destructible map, and you have to defeat the opposing team of worms in real-time asynchronous combat divided into turns, if that even makes sense. Each turn has a set length predefined in-game settings, usually between 30 and 60 seconds, and a whole run takes no more than 15 minutes on average, after which, with every turn, the water level keeps rising, adding to the urgency and excitement. In one turn, as long as the time allows for that, you can move your worm freely, pick up upgrades, choose between numerous available weapons, and shoot at the enemy. One attack per worm per turn. After the shot is taken, mine drop or a special tool used, or when the time runs out, the enemy takes their turn, and so on until there's only one team left alive. Worms can be played by up to 4 players on a single system, and while it's very chaotic with so many people at once, it's also most fun. The little few pixels in size worms are chock full of character, commenting on in-game happenings and dying in the most cute ways you've seen. Weapons range from box standard and serious to unusual, incredibly creative and fun, like the banana bomb or holy hand grenade. Combat between experienced players when most of the landscape is destroyed and worms stand on the last few small landmasses, shooting at each other from afar while the time keeps clocking, foretelling the inevitable deadly flooding, is some of the best and most exciting experiences you can have on the Amiga. Is Tearaway Thomas Amiga's answer to Sonic as some gaming max touted years ago? Well, why don't you make your own mind about it while I'll tell you what it actually is, other than potentially that. It's an incredibly fast action platformer and an Amiga exclusive, which should not come as a surprise as it's in this video. It's probably a bit too fast for its own good actually, as if it would have landed in a player's such as myself library back then, I would have probably dismissed it, as I'm not much into those Sonic fast platformers in which you don't really explore the levels, but rather breeze through them at lightning fast speeds. I may not play or even complete some of them, but if I had anything else other than those to play, then they would have landed in the back of the to-play pile of my discs, waiting for their turn, often for months on end. But that's on me, and most Amiga gamers who would have had a chance to play it would probably enjoy it, as there's actually a lot to like here. It's composed out of 50 levels divided into 5 groups of 10 each, and in each you have to collect a certain minimum required number of gems to progress to the next. So the loop in Tearaway Thomas is that simple. Find the gems, find the exit, go through it, all in the allotted and constantly ticking down time, rinse and repeat. Each gem color has a different number of points assigned to them, but there are no point requirements to complete the stages or the game, so they're only needed for the high scores. And I'm neither speedrunner, completionist or a score table assassin, so they make no difference to me. They may to you though, so keep that in mind. The enemies are everywhere, and are in most cases various cute animals. They are not deadly though, and all they really do when in contact with our hero is make Thomas lose precious seconds of his timer. Tearaway Thomas is not an easy game. partly because of the timer, partly because of the speed, but despite all that, today, years later, I can appreciate and even enjoy it in a limited manner for what it is. So, if you like platformers, and especially those that are faster than the speeding bullet, it's definitely not a game to pass on. How did you find the first season? Was Amiga a great gaming system, or was it a great gaming system? Yeah, I know what I said. Anyway, hit them likes, subscribes and bells to make sure not to miss any new videos, and I'll see you soon. If you like the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. Smash them if you have to, it helps more than you could ever know. Also, I would like to thank you and all my amazing Patreon and YouTube members for helping this channel keep going. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank all the wonderful folks who record and upload playthroughs, let's plays and other retro-centric videos here on YouTube, because they help to preserve the games that would have otherwise be long forgotten. So thank you.